William Mann is a 32nd degree Mason and an officer of the Knights Templar. You know, the Catholic military order formed in the 12th century and charged with safeguarding pilgrims to the Holy Land, who, according to legend, amassed an unimaginable fortune, managed to raise the ire of the Vatican and a number of Catholic kings in Europe, were hunted down, executed, some escaped, with their treasure, possibly to North America. Yes, those Knights Templar, apparently they still exist. And Bill Mann's new book, The Last Refuge of the Knights Templar, while a piece of fiction, is based on actual correspondence between two famous, or perhaps infamous, 19th century Masonic leaders. Albert Pike, arguably the most powerful and influential Mason in America, and his Canadian counterpart, Colonel J.W.B. MacLeod Moore. Not only did Bill Mann uncover the cache of letters, but he weaved them into a brilliant thriller. Imagine the Da Vinci Code meets National Treasure. We're not going to give too much of the book away, but instead we'll focus on the actual life of the aforementioned Albert Pike, a mountain of a man, author, poet, orator, jurist, and prominent member of the Freemasons. He was also a senior officer of the Confederate States Army, who commanded the District of Indian Territory in the Trans-Mississippi Theater of the American Civil War. Pike also authored the most important book on Freemasonry, Morals and Dogma. He's been accused of being a Luciferian. He may have been involved in the plot to assassinate President Lincoln. He was pro-slavery, but considered a great ally of the American Indian. Who was Albert Pike? With author, 32nd degree Mason, Bill Mann. Coming up in the second half of the program, Nathaniel Gillis is a religious demonologist and author, and after living in a haunted house for 20 years researching what it was he encountered, he's sought to redefine the nature of haunting phenomena, ghosts, and high strangeness. He'll discuss his encounters with unclean spirits, discarnate entities, incubi and succubi, and demons, and why he believes they, the demons, bear little resemblance to the horned devils we learned about in Sunday school. From Masons to demons. Well, I never said we were going to talk about unicorns and rainbows, did I? Welcome to the Audio Imaginarium. Come on in, weary traveler, hang your cloak on a peg, grab a stool, and come gather round the fire. There are stories to be told, and you are among friends. I'm Richard Serrett, and this is Coast to Coast AM. Why don't you stay a while? William F. Mann is an officer of the Knights Templar of Canada's Grand Executive Committee, a member of its Grand Council, and serves as the Sovereign Great Priory's Grand Archivist. He's also a 32nd degree Scottish Rite Mason, being a member of the Merton Lodge of Perfection, Hamilton Sovereign Chapter of Rose-Croix, and Moore Sovereign Consistory, Hamilton. William is also a past preceptor of Godfrey de Bouillon Preceptory, No. 3, Hamilton District, No. 2 of the United Religious and Military Orders of St. John's of Jerusalem, Palestine, Rhodes, and Malta, of the Order of the Temple, Knights Templar of Canada. Templar sanctuaries in North America, the Templar Meridians, the Knights Templar in the New World, the 13th Pillar are just several of his books. His latest is called The Last Refuge of the Knights Templar. William F. Mann, welcome back to Coast AM. How are you?
Good. Thanks very much, Richard. How are you?
I hope I wasn't interrupting your plans for... I'm terrific. I hope I wasn't interrupting your plans for world domination. Do you get that a lot? Do people say, "Oh, the Masons, your plot"?
Well, you know what? It's unfortunately watching what's happening around the world, and specifically in North America. It's saddening tonight.
Absolutely, yes. A lot of people might be surprised, and I'd have to count myself as one of them, that the Knights Templar are still around. As I mentioned in my introduction, we think of the Knights Templar as guarding or safeguarding the pilgrims to the Holy Land. They were created in the 12th century. They seem to have sort of vanished. and here you are, a member of the Knights Templar of Canada.
Absolutely.
The fact that you're still around is amazing.
It's one of those situations where Masonry has always been secretive. We don't pertain to too many secrets, but we've always been secretive. So for over 1,000 years, yes, there's been this continuous history of Knights Templar and Freemasonry.
And what is the difference between a Mason and a Knights Templar?
Well, Knights Templar, in this case, in my case, it's known as Christian Masonry. It's the highest level of Freemasonry on the York Rite side, on the English side. In Scottish Rite Masonry, it's one of the highest degrees within the 32 degrees of Scottish Rite Masonry. So it really meets at the top of the pyramid, per se, if you'd like.
So the last refuge of the Knights Templar is a work of fiction, but Albert Pike, and we'll talk about his life here in a moment, is such a larger-than-life character. Some might say he's somewhat notorious, controversial. He's such an amazing character, though. Did you give any consideration to writing this book as a piece of nonfiction? Just because, I mean, the story of uncovering the letters and so forth, it's such a thriller all on its own. Why the need to fictionalize?
Well, unfortunately, as you see, especially in America, even tonight, there's certain facets of the right-wing politics, the neo-fascists, the neo-Nazis, that they consider wrongly that Albert Pike is almost a demigod to them, that they see themselves or emulating the earlier Albert Pike in terms of the nefarious ways that Pike went about things.
All right, so let's talk about Albert Pike, his early life, because obviously, a brilliant mind. How old was he when he was accepted into Harvard? Was he something like 13 or 14?
He was 16, and he was self-taught. Actually, they say he was self-taught, but he was guided by the Jesuits, which is very interesting in itself, because the Jesuits have had a hand in his career and had a sort of a guiding hand in his whole lifetime of education and spirituality. But
he couldn't afford to go to Harvard, I understand. So where did he end up going?
Well, he was actually accepted into Harvard. He didn't end up going, but he was self-taught and wrote the bar exam for Arkansas on his own, and which is amazing when you think about it, even at that time in the 1840s. And from that, he developed an amazing career as both a lawyer and, as you indicated, a Confederate soldier, and then a politician, and then behind the scenes, he came to the forefront as the lifelong sovereign Grand Commander of the Scottish Rite of the Southern Jurisdiction of the United States.
But before that, he was kind of an outdoorsman as well. Loved to, I believe, hunt and fish. There's a legendary story of him traveling from, I believe it's Arkansas to Taos, New Mexico. Tell us what happened along the way.
Well, just after the start of his journey, his horse up and died. And most people would have quit and gone home, but Albert Pike, for some reason, took it upon himself to travel the 1,500 miles by foot, which really gives you an indication in terms of the self-determination, the inner spirituality of the character of the man, in order to have that determination to really complete that journey. And his whole life was a lifelong journey of learning. He taught himself how to speak 15 different languages. Probably 7, 8 of them are now extinct. And over time, over a period of over 30 years, he wrote numerous books, probably one of the most famous of them being Morals and Dogma of the Scottish Rite Freemasonry, and that book is actually given to any Scottish Rite Freemason in the southern jurisdiction, which has gone through 32 degrees over 150 years.
And he came back to Arkansas. I believe he started. Was it a newspaper that he started after marrying? She was a descendant of the Alexander Hamilton, I think.
Yes. He wasn't a stupid man per se. He married into money, and it held him in good stead throughout his lifetime.
And was he raised a Christian? What was his religious background?
He wasn't an atheist, but he was one of those that believed that right from the start that he could converse with God in a different manner, in a direct manner. He was raised by the Jesuits, but he never did become a Roman Catholic. So it's interesting in itself, even from an earlier age, he took it upon himself to understand God on an individual level, something that most people haven't done over a lifetime.
And how did he, or how was he introduced to Freemasonry?
He was introduced very, very innocently. He became an Odd Fellow, first of all, and the Odd Fellows still exist, but there aren't many lodges around nowadays. But he became an Odd Fellow, and through that, there was an appeal of Freemasonry, especially in the southern states. The southern states was such at that time a hotbed of Freemasonry, and he was introduced by some very influential people.
And I mean, he seemed to be a conflicted man, because on the one hand he was pro-slavery, right?
He was pro-slavery, but on the other hand, he was supportive of the North American Indian throughout his lifetime, which, as you indicated, is a real conflict. His belief was that the independent states really had the decision in terms of whether to be pro-slavery or not. He was against federalism, and that's how he found himself ending up joining and fighting the Confederate for the Confederate cause during the Civil War.
Was he a slave owner himself?
He wasn't a slave owner himself. Earlier in life, obviously, he didn't have the wherewithal, the means to own slaves at that time. But he promoted the ownership of slaves. He saw that as the only way that the southern states would be able to continue on an economically viable basis to compete against the northern industry.
And then, as you say, on the other hand, he had an affinity for North American Indians, and he argued on their behalf as a lawyer, I think, all the way to the Supreme Court. Tell me about that case.
He actually, following the Civil War, he argued on behalf of the North American Indians, in particular the Cherokee and the Choctaw, for their land rights, and he actually won the case at federal high court. But unfortunately, the North American Indian, the Cherokees, were never able to acknowledge what they had won during that federal case.
And why was he considered such a friend? I mean, obviously because he fought for them in the courts, but where did that come from? His interest in the North American Indian, their culture, their life. Why was he such a friend?
He'd been introduced to the North American Indian rather early in life, and through his travels and endeavors through what's known as the Indian Territory, Oklahoma, and other southern states. And he obviously developed an affinity towards the North American Indians, recognizing in many ways he was introduced, he was trusted and introduced into numbers of secret societies of the North American Indian, including the main secret society of the Algonquin Nation, known as the Midewin. And the Midewin, in actual fact, due to this notion that the Knights Templar arrived in North America in pre-Columbian times and strategically intermarried with the Algonquin Nation, the Midewin reflected the Knights Templar ritual, and he recognized this on a very early stage, to the point that he was initiated into the Midewin. And it was through that he was able to encourage a number of the Algonquin nations to fight for the Confederates during the Civil War.
So he was well versed in this legend of the Knights Templar, having come to North America. So
absolutely, and I think that he recognized through the myths and legends and other notions, signs, seals, tokens of the North American Indians, that in fact it was proof that the Knights Templar actually did arrive in North America in the 12th, 13th, and 14th century.
Did the Algonquins, for example, confirm that to him, that yes, this is true?
Well, you have to understand a little bit about my background, whereas my father's side of my background is very English and very military-oriented, and that's where I get the Masonic relationships. But on my mother's side, my mother is full-blooded Algonquin, and it's through family members, through my association with both sides, that it's been proven that in actual fact there have been these marriages, intermarriages, and my mother and father are proof of that over 400 years since the arrival of the Knights Templar in North America.
His career in the Confederate Army, how did that begin?
Well, it was interesting. Because of his association with North American Indians, obviously the Confederates realized there was real potential to draw the Indians into the conflict on the southern side, and it was through Albert Pike that they were able to do that, so he was actually appointed a brigadier general in the Confederate Army.
When did he run afoul of the Confederates? Because they tried to arrest him.
The problem is that like anything else, he couldn't control the native battalions, and there was a famous Battle of Pea Ridge, where the natives overran the Union Army to the point that they started scalping all the Union soldiers, and this horrified even the Southern Confederacy, and then they wanted the native battalions to become part of the regular Southern Confederacy Army and to fight outside the Indian Territory. And the agreement between Pike and the natives was that this wouldn't happen, and so that's where he ran afoul. And he was actually charged with treason by the Southern Confederacy and hid out in the Arkansas backwoods until he essentially got the charges dropped.
And then after the end of the Civil War, he was being hunted down by the Union as well, right?
Well, this is the most fascinating thing. He was hunted down by the Union because he was in fact linked to or potentially linked to the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. So he fled. He fled across the states and ended up in Ottawa, Canada for 3 months until he miraculously, very interesting, received a pardon by then President Andrew Johnson.
Now, the Knights of the Golden Circle, that was the secret society that was involved in the plot to assassinate Lincoln, not once but twice. Of course, the first time failed, the second time was successful. Can he be tied to the Knights of the Golden Circle? Is there a paper trail?
Well, there's not actually a paper trail. There's a lot of speculation that he was, in actual fact, part of the Knights of the Golden Circle, but he can be tied directly to the Ku Klux Klan. He was a Grand Dragon of Arkansas, and he actually wrote the rituals of the Ku Klux Klan. Of course, the Ku Klux Klan, for any historian, its basis, its formation was a little different than what it had evolved into. So Albert Pike, on one hand, could be seen as an absolute criminal, but on the other hand, he could be seen as just supporting the rights of the southern states, even after the collapse, their collapse after the Civil War.
And how does, he was as I mentioned earlier, a mountain of a man. I think he was like 6 foot something, 300 pounds, hair down to his shoulders. How does someone like that escape into Canada undetected?
Well, I think when you say undetected, I think it's obvious from any of the research that I've done that he had the help of many Masons. He was regarded at that time as one of the highest-ranking Masons in North America, and it was through the help of his counterpart in Canada at the time, British North America, Colonel William James Bury MacLeod Moore, who really was instrumental in bringing Knights Templarism along with Scottish Rite Masonry and Rosicrucianism to North America.
So let's talk about his Canadian counterpart, Colonel J.W.B. MacLeod Moore, you just mentioned,
yes.
Who helped and aided and abetted Albert Pike. And these two would go on to correspond, and we'll talk about their letters in a moment. But who was he?
William James Bury MacLeod Moore was your atypical British colonel in the British Army. He was born in Ireland. He was initiated in the Freemasonry at the age of 18. Became a career British Army officer, and when he was stationed on the Isle of Malta, he reintroduced Knights Templarism to the Isle of Malta. So he was very well regarded within the areas of Freemasonry, but above all, he was a British colonel. So if you compare Albert Pike, who was this gigantic, sort of gregarious, almost Santa Claus-like figure with long flowing beard and long flowing hair, and MacLeod Moore, who's this rigid British Army officer, you couldn't have two different men even if you tried. And
at what point did the two men start to correspond?
They started to correspond really 1867. And their correspondence continued to right to the point of MacLeod Moore's death in 1890, and Albert Pike followed them not a year later in 1891. So there was over 30 years of correspondence altogether.
And how many letters in total, do you know?
33 letters, which is actually interesting considering there's if you include the honorary degree of 33 associated with Scottish Rite Freemasonry, this was not by coincidence. I think Albert Pike actually controlled it and worked it that way so that they were 33 letters altogether.
And tell us how you uncovered these letters. I mean, this has to be for Masons like the find of the century. How did you uncover them?
Well, just very innocently, about 6 years ago, I was appointed Grand Archivist, Grand Historian for Sound Great Prairie, Canada, and in that I inherited really the guardianship of a number of artifacts, relics, clothing, jewels, and a whole series of files. And in those file boxes, unbeknownst to me, and I don't think unbeknownst to anybody else, because they were covered in dust, there was this file folder, very innocent And I went through them, and it took me a few reads to realize the significance of these letters, and had them authenticated by the Grand Historian, Grand Archivist in Washington, D.C., that they were in fact letters from Albert Pike to MacLeod Moore, which MacLeod Moore had actually collected and saved.
And what was your reaction when you realized what you were holding in your hands?
Well, you can imagine my reaction. I almost fell to the floor. But it took me a while to understand. I laid out the letters. You have to understand a lot of them were almost disintegrating due to their poor condition. And as I read them, I realized that they were written in certain levels. Unbeknownst to just a regular reader, but given my 25 years of Freemasonry and my involvement in another number of orders and bodies, I realized that there were hidden levels of coded messages within the letters themselves.
Without giving the book away, obviously, but can you give me an example and how you were able to decipher these layers of codes and encryption?
Well, the main premise of my book, is that there's a sacred vault. A sacred vault's been established by the medieval Knights Templar in North America, and in that they collected all of the Templar treasure, which had disseminated after its initial discovery under the rules of the Temple of Jerusalem, and that Knights Templar collected these sacred relics, documents, and other artifacts, and culminated in the sacred vault in Western North America. And that depository is to be used for the establishment of a New Jerusalem and a rebuilding of the Temple of Solomon at the appropriate time.
So these letters confirm that the Templar treasure, whatever that might be, whether it's gold or silver or knowledge, whatever it is, these letters confirm that it was brought to North America for safekeeping.
Yes, and that's the most amazing thing to high-ranking Freemason Knights Templar such as myself, but also to be disseminated really very quietly to the public. This is an amazing revelation, and again, coming full circle, at the start of the show, you talked about why I felt compelled to incorporate it within a fictional story. And as I indicated, there's certain people, there's certain societies that would probably kill to get their hands on the, as you say, the knowledge, the relics, and the physical treasure that lies there to this day.
So, I mean, this is a real-life national treasure. I mean, we've seen the movie with Nicolas Cage. It has elements of that in it, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And but you could say what fact was the movie National Treasure based on, and there were certain facts there, and it spoke of the Templar treasure, which actually made its way to North America, and it. In the case of the movie, it was within a pit, but really the idea is the same, that there's a sacred vault which lies somewhere in North America.
How long did it take you to break the code?
It probably took me, as I say, a lifetime of learning and knowledge and understanding, but it probably took me about a year.
And once you broke that code and realized this is proof that the Templar treasure is here in North America, I mean, who do you run to tell that to? As you say, this could put your life in jeopardy. Yes,
and I want anybody listening out there to know that I don't have the letters in my possession. They've been secreted away in terms of their safety, but That's the big question: is if I recover the Templar treasure, and that's another question. Who does it belong to? And obviously, there's going to be certain groups ranging from the Vatican to the American government, which are going to lay claim to this treasure.
All right, so we should go back a little bit to the, I guess, the demise, if I can use that word, of the Knights Templar in Europe after they had amassed this treasure, and we will, maybe going into the next hour or after the top of the hour, we'll discuss what that treasure might be. So, how did they run afoul of the Vatican and a number of Catholic dynasties in Europe?
Well, they ran afoul of both the Catholic Church and the French royalty, King Philippe IV. It was on a Friday evening, October the 13th, 1307, that there was this like SWAT team movement across Europe that the King of France had orchestrated with the support of the Vatican. But luckily, the Templar treasure had been spirited away out of France even before then, because the Knights Templar possessed essentially the greatest counter-espionage unit at the time across North America and the old world, Europe. So they ran afoul because they had lent enormous sums of money to both the Vatican and the French court. And obviously the French court specifically wasn't able to pay it back, so they created a number of fallacies, a number of lies aimed towards the Knights Templar in order to justify their obliteration. But when you talk about their demise, it never really happened. There were a certain number of people, including the Grand Master at the time, Jacques de Molay, who gave themselves up in order to provide time for the treasure to be spirited out of France.
And how many Knights Templar were there at the height of this order?
Well, at the height of the order, essentially you have to understand that it was the Knights Templar who really orchestrated, along with certain Cistercian monks, the Crusades, the first through the 7 Crusades. In essence, there were tens of thousands Knights Templar, and they're supporting squires and army. At the height of the time, most of the French nobility provided one or more sons to become Knights Templar on their holy crusades.
And after the crackdown in Europe, and they fled, how many do you believe fled to North America?
Well, in essence, the Knights Templar were very strategic. They believed not to put their eggs all in one basket. There were groups of Templars that fled to Denmark, fled to Scotland, fled to England, fled to Portugal. I would say that there were at least 500 Knights Templar that fled directly to North America. And as I say, settled and intermarried with the North American Indian.
My name is George Knapp, your occasional host, designated driver of the airwaves, and moderator of tonight's upcoming cacophony of conversation. Glad to be back with you once again. Chris Milligan is a writer, researcher, and publisher for Trine Day Books. His father was in the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which was sort of the precursor to CIA. Dad also went on to the CIA, rising to branch chief, head of intelligence analysis for East Asia. We mention that because it's relevant to what Chris has done with his life. The father told Chris some things that he didn't understand back at the time, but those revelations led to more than 30 years of research into the kind of subjects that we talk about on this program: the CIA, drugs, clandestine operations, conspiracy theories, and secret societies. Chris recently spoke to the National Press Club about secret societies, intel agencies, generational politics, and I guess it was a real barn burner. Chris, the first time you've been on the program since 2004. Good to have you back.
You bet. Well, thank you very, very much for having me back, sir. I really appreciate it.
What's in a name, Trine Day? What does that mean, the name of the publishing company?
Well, when we started off, we wanted to name it Good Day Press, and there was somebody already named Good Day Press, and I happened to be going through the dictionary, and I stumbled across the word trine, and it meant auspicious, and then also, I'm a musician, and I like puns, and trying day, going to work sometimes is a trying day, too. So it's, I thought it sounded okay, so it became Trine Day.
Your company seems to specialize in what you call suppressed topics. I mean, do you mean literally suppressed topics that nobody else would publish or that the government has tried to sit on or stifle?
Absolutely. I mean, it literally blew my mind, you might say. Once a friend of mine, I was running an email list, and a friend of mine on there, he'd been an executive producer of a show, aired internationally on NBC, and he had a book with an agent for 2 years in New York, and he was decrying that nobody would publish his book. And after hearing that a couple times, I says, well, I've got a computer on my desk. They tell me I can make a book. And then I helped him make a book. And then my friend, Professor Anthony Sutton, excellent researcher and writer, his book, America's Secret Establishment, was going out of print. And I said, Anthony, we can't do that. It's never been in hardback. It's never been in libraries. We need to do something. And so I went and borrowed $5,000 and started a publishing company. And 3 weeks after I had it out, Anthony died. But I put it out anyway, and put out a little book about Vietnam. And just by standing up, I had authors throwing books at me that were amazing books, and the reason why they weren't getting printed because they followed certain subjects that were being suppressed, and New York just was not publishing them, so I started publishing them.
Tell me this: do you vet all the books? I looked at the list of the things you published. It's wide ranging, that's for sure. Do you vet this stuff? Do you stand by it, or you're just publishing it and letting people decide?
Oh no, absolutely. We vet it. We go through editing, and I turn down a lot more than we publish. And no, we vet some of it. Some of it takes us 2 years before we get the book out because we take a long time in looking at it.
How do you deal with the inevitable label of you as a conspiracy nut? Well, you'll put out anything that's crazy enough or that slams the government. You're just a conspiracy nut, which, is the kind of label that we get here at Coast as well as a way to marginalize the information that comes out. Well,
I don't know. I've been dealing with it for a long time. Live up here at Oregon, just kind of goes off your back, because when you look at, I first heard some things from my father, okay, and it was very serious. He took me in a little room and with a professor and sat me down and told me some things, and, I didn't understand him, okay, but, I looked into it, and the more you look into it, you find validation for what there's there, and then once you see the seriousness of the situation, if we don't do something now, our children won't be able to because they'll be completely locked down in a big brother state. And
well, let's talk about what your father told you. You mentioned it, actually. I noticed it was in the foreword to the book that we're talking about later tonight, An American in the Basement. You mentioned about the conversation you had. Tell me a little bit more about your dad's background, why he was in a position to know what he told you and what it is he said.
Well, he got involved in intelligence as an 18-year-old kid, as an exchange student to the University of Shanghai in China in the 30s. And then the war came along, and in 1940, he was in COI, which was Donovan's first organization, then OSS. Then he got sheep-dipped, got put into G2, and got into deep politics. And then from there, from World War II, he went through a couple alphas and was in CIA at his beginning. Then he went, you said earlier his last overt job was branch chief, head of all of East Asia, and then he went covert for a while. And then I was a little kid. He was supposedly a advertising salesman and part-time speechwriter, and he went to Southeast Asia they told us he was going to write a book on the church in Southeast Asia, and he never wrote it. And when he came back, things really changed. I mean, I was just a little kid, but we'd been living at this house for a long time. They had plans to build things there, and then all of a sudden the house got put up for sale. We were going to move to Rochester, New York, and then all of a sudden we were going to move to Rochester, Minnesota. We went out and bought, big winter coats, and then all of a sudden we didn't do anything, and the house sold. We moved to another little new subdivision in Fairfax outside D.C., and then all of a sudden we were there for about a year and a half, and then my dad was appointed to be a vice president of a college. And we moved to Tennessee, and we were there for a couple of years, and the president resigned. They asked my dad to be president. He said no and moved the whole family out to Oregon. This was 1959. I was 10 years old, just what do? You follow the family, right? And then later on in the late 60s, he asked me what I thought of the Vietnam War, and I gave him a flip little answer as a teenager. I says, well, you've got a sack of hand grenades, and you've got some rice patties. You go throw the hand grenades, and went for the good guys wearing the white hats, Been raised on John Wayne in World War II, and just gave him a flip answer. And he said we had to have a talk. And then, a couple of years later almost, I finally figured out the date of the talk. It was the day before my 20th birthday. And there was this professor from Vanderbilt in town, Professor D.F. Fleming, and my dad took me in my little brother's room and said, he opened his mouth and said, the Vietnam War is about drugs. There's these secret societies behind it. And I'm thinking, Dad, okay, you're talking about the mafia. And then he says, and communism's all a sham. These same secret societies are behind it all. It's all a big game. And at that point in time, I think my dad's absolutely nuts, and I'm a teenager, and I know a heck of a lot more than he does. And it's the late 60s, and I'm growing my hair long, and I'm smoking a little marijuana. And so I'm thinking, my dad's having the drug talk with me, because he hadn't had the sex talk with me. I was married and had a little kid, and I was almost 20, so I get to, I'm straightening up, and I'm going to say, yes, sir, I'm waiting for my dad to tell me to stop smoking pot. And he doesn't do that. He continues to tell me about his intelligence career, and tells me that they're playing out a loose scenario in Vietnam, and starts talking to me about psychological warfare and stuff. And after a while, it becomes fairly apparent that I have no idea of what they're talking about, and I have no frame of reference. And so I had some other conversations with my father and some arguments, and one thing he told me, he says they're out to opiate your whole generation. And it just didn't make a lot of sense to me.
Did he tell you not to tell anybody?
No, he didn't. He didn't tell me not to. He told me that when he had signed up in the 30s, the thing that he had signed said that he couldn't talk for 10 years. And he said that when he had moved the whole family out there after he had turned down to be president of this college, because, as a kid, it was very interesting, because we moved to this, and he became a college student. And then pretty soon we didn't have the income, and he had to, he soon started teaching junior high school. So he went from a vice president of a college, being a college student, to teaching. And no, he didn't tell me not to tell anybody. But it was interesting. I a little bit later on, just back to your question, I went and told some people some things of what my father said. And they looked at me, and this was in the early 70s, and they said, well, gosh, you're a conspiracy theorist. And I kind of scratched my head and said, what's a conspiracy theorist? And so I took conspiracy theory on as an intellectual discipline, and to study it, to see what it meant. And it was very interesting, because I would go into, I've always been a voracious reader, and I would go into every bookstore I could find. I would say, take me to your conspiracy section. and all of them had at least one book. Okay, and after starting reading these books, I said, gosh, some of these are almost formula books designed to divide and conquer us, to make us, because I can find you a book that blames it all on the Jews. I can find you a book that blames it all on the Catholics. I can find you a book that blames it all on the hippies. I can find you a book that blames it all on the Mormons. What do you want? And so it's because, one thing, a conspiracy theory doesn't have to be true to be effective. And every day, all of us make decisions based upon somebody or our own conspiracy theory. So as much as they poo-poo it, conspiracy theory is used all the time.
Is there a point at which that conversation with dear old Dad came back to you, that the light sort of goes on, and you realize not only is conspiracy theory interesting in itself, but some of this stuff is true?
Well, I was 8 years old when Kennedy was shot, and it never sat right with me. So I'd always be, reading about that. And there in the late 60s and early 70s, there was a lot of stories about the Kennedy assassination. And then they started to have stories about what my dad told me, CIA drugs, in the girly magazines. And I was reading one of these, Gallery or Penthouse, something like that, and some story, and it was talking about the Kennedy assassination. And they were talking about all the different theories of, CIA, mafia, blah, blah, and there was a little throwaway line, and then they say, and some people talk about the involvement of secret societies. And that brought back the conversation that I'd had with my dad. And I really started to think about it, because when he first told me, he just told me, and, it sat there in my head, and, I got to think about it. But when I read that, it really brought it back, and that's when I really started to investigate it. And, one way I investigate is I'll get a book and read it, and go to the bibliography and go to those books and read it. And pretty soon you're out of, tomes on conspiracy theory, and you're into dusty tomes about banking and intelligence services and stuff like that, and secret societies. And finding information out about secret societies, especially the Order of Skull and Bones, was very, very hard until I came across Professor Sutton's work.
Well, we're definitely going to talk about Skull and Bones and secret societies, but I wanted to sort of stick with some of the more current stuff first, and we'll be going to a break here in a minute. Let's start with a general kind of a statement from you about whether or not you're encouraged or discouraged by sort of that litany that I mentioned in the introduction to this, the NSA scandal and all the other ones that seem to be unfolding around us. On one hand, I guess it's encouraging that we're getting a peek behind the curtain. On the other, wow, there's a lot of bad stuff going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I was listening to your thing. I said, boy, that's a lot of, but you talked about the optimism at the beginning. And yes, I'm very, very optimistic, because I see a lot of good things happening. And when I first started to delve into this, the ability of the intelligence agencies and these forces behind the shadows to control information and to control bureaucracies was much tighter. And so, yes, I'm very, very encouraged that I think very good things are going to happen, because a lot of things, they're two-edged swords. I mean, the technology is here, and obviously we could, enter to a very dark age of a very big brother, manipulation. You
said on one hand you're encouraged, but there's a flip side.
Well, no, I'm very encouraged. I think that we have the opportunity here, if just a little bit of, time and effort is spent on getting away from it. I'm very encouraged, because there's so much time and effort that's spent on subjugating us, and if just a little bit was spent on having an enlightened, on having a very good life on this amazing blue ball that's spinning through space, that there's not very many. And I think we're coming to the realization that we don't need to be all this fighting going on.
Well, let's take a couple of examples, because this is the business you're in. You put out books that expose conspiracies, secret societies, secrets, things of that sort. What do you think about Edward Snowden? Now, there's a lot of people see him as an absolute traitor to his country. He signed a secrecy oath. He violated it. Now he's in Russia, which is not exactly it might be a good move for him legally, but not a very good move PR-wise.
Well, I really don't know, because, all I see is what I get from the mainstream media, and I found the mainstream media to be very suspect. And they're very sophisticated psychological warfare games that are going on. Part of the shtick of these people in the shadows is to make us think that we shouldn't have a government, that government is bad. We first had our first anti-Illuminati scare in the late 1700s. People went to George Washington and talked to him about them. And he says, yes, they're here. Their tenets are diabolical. And what they're after is to divorce us from our institutions, okay, our family, our faith, and government, because we need government. Now, here's how the secret societies run the world. And basically, they're using America as a cat's paw, as a tool, okay? And the secret societies run the world. It's a leviathan of 3 levels, and each level has 3 parts, okay? The top level is mining, metal, and money. And, you think about it, and it kind of makes sense, And when I look at the families at Skull and Bones, I find all these mining families and all these mining engineers, okay? And I watch some of their machinations of taking over mining companies, okay? And then
is mining, under mining, do you include oil as a general generic?
Level,
okay.
The next level is drugs, guns, and oil.
Okay.
And it was a guy from Skull and Bones in 1855 that took petroleum, rock oil, and first made gasoline. And he said, gee, gentlemen, I think you have something here with a very inexpensive process. You have some very valuable products. Soon the Pennsylvania Rock Oil Company, who he wrote that report for, was passed into hands of investors in New Haven, Connecticut, where Skull and Bones was based. The people who started the Pennsylvania Rock Oil Company soon had their very sons at Yale in the Order of Skull and Bones. Rockefellers are members of the Order of Skull and Bones. They're a member of there's a Rockefeller in every secret society at Yale. There's 7 of them that I can get my hands on their membership list. And then they've been involved with the drug smuggling ever since basic drug smuggling, modern drug smuggling started in the 1700s. And then arms, they're very much in the forefront of a lot of the arms dealers, and you find them selling arms to both sides at the wars and also involved in the armistice talks. And then the last level, where it hits the road, is media, okay, movies / music, because they need to control the culture. And then the very last thing is quote-unquote magic, okay, where because the ability to hoodwink us, to make us think that something else is going on. And then their preponderance on using mass trauma in this psychological warfare, because basically what's going on, okay, is these forces out of the shadows, and there was a bit of public discussion about this in the late 1800s, about whether we were going to be an empire or a republic. Well, the powers in the shadows took us to being to being an empire, but they didn't tell the people. I mean, we still put our hand over our heart and pledge allegiance to the republic. Well, what they're doing is they're using these psychological games and generational politics, okay, to move us from being free individual citizens of a republic to being slaves of an empire.
Well, I mean, there's no argument there. It sounded to me like you were saying that these forces, those 3 levels, are in favor of less government, and I always had the impression they're in favor of more of it. When you look at the support for the NSA and the kind of surveillance that's been underway for years, that seems like a lot more government and intrusion into our lives and less personal liberty, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. And actually moving us away from civil government to corporate governance.
Right.
And again, it's an empire.
I want to come back to Skull and Bones in a minute, but before we leave this and Snowden thing, and if you don't want to talk about it, it's fine, but I'm just trying to figure it out in my own head, because I'm bothered by some of it. The guy does sign this security oath and then spills it. I welcome the fact that he spilled this secret, but I'm trying to figure out what is the big secret that he spilled, because is there anybody in the country, in the world, is there any government in the world that did not already know NSA was spying on all of us, that it had the ability to basically intercept every email, every phone call, store it all on giant computers? I mean, I think we've assumed that for a long time, in part because of other guests we've had over the years on this program and probably other books that your company has published.
Well, yes, and again, it goes back to, I mean, this story is getting play all over the media, correct? Okay.
Sure.
And, we have a book by Daniel Estlin, who's been on your on Coast to Coast several times. And it's called Deconstructing WikiLeaks. And one thing he goes in there and he shows that, Mr. Assange mostly has done the bidding of the Western intelligence agencies. I mean, and when he comes with it out, who's his partners, the New York Times and The Economist. These are people that regularly attend the Bilderberg meetings that don't tell us anything about it. Okay, so, and when we brought that book out, people ran the other way because people need heroes. I mean, we need heroes. It's a dark time. I mean, we're being assaulted on all kinds of things. Who knows what the future holds, blah, blah, blah. So we need heroes, and people hate to hear something that this guy maybe, is not a hero or is being used. And it's a lot of people, they get played. And then if they're assets, if they're just, assets at the end of the trail, then they just get dropped and get twisted in the wind. And again, it goes back to it's being played big in the media. I mean, you're going to have later on Miss Yarsinski. I mean, she's an amazing journalist. She has over 55 books out, okay? I mean, when she first told the story about Scott Spiker, I mean, the book came out from a major New York publisher. Well, she's a very dogged investigator and very courageous. And she finally, got the story down to the end. Well, New York wouldn't publish it. I mean, the lady has 55 books out. She has a lot of contacts in the publishing firm. I mean, she had to reach out to me to get the book published. This is, one of the things where we stand up and are doing our suppressed works because, books are very, important. There's a reason why, quote unquote, they burn books, okay? Because, when you can hand somebody, somebody's thoughts and in this thing that you can hold between your hands, it's a very powerful thing. And,
it just seems to me that Snowden's real crime is humiliating U.S. government by confirming what probably everybody, all intelligence agencies in the world already knew or suspected,
right,
confirming that we've been spying on everybody.
Right, and they've come out and told us that directly, and the gentleman who created the NASA, the NSA network, told us completely how it worked a couple years ago. And I go back to, Amy has this amazing story, and we can't get any press about it all. I mean, I've got a PR firm. We sent out all kinds of notices and stuff like that. We get some radio interviews, but I can't get it on the in the newspaper. I mean, we do a book by a gal who's the girlfriend of Lee Harvey Oswald. I mean, it was verified by 60 Minutes. The guy from 60 Minutes. Okay, the guy who started 60 Minutes, we have him on videotape. He tried to break the story. The door was slammed shut on him from the people up above him,
I interviewed her on this show.
Right, and if 60 Minutes can't break the story, okay, that tells me that something's going on there in the media that's blocking, and they're doing it for a reason, and a lot of it has to do with the psychological warfare. And, you see, getting back to one thing my father told me, he says, they're out to opiate your whole generation. Okay, and one thing that they were looking to do is the baby boomers, which I was right in the middle of, they were looking to create a drugged-out peace generation. Okay, they didn't want us talking to our parents. They wanted us to be an antithesis, okay, to our parents, so that then they could scare people in the suburbs and everywhere, so they could start the drug war and this assault on our Constitution. Okay, and then us, the boomers weren't supposed to cohese as a generation. And there's a very good book called Generation, A History of America's Future. I strongly recommend people read it because it has a lot to do with the dynamics of what's going on.
You think Snowden, somebody will take him out, if you had to guess?
You know, I don't know. I mean, he's a useful person right now because it's generating some talk about it. I mean, is this there's people that talk about in psychological warfare. You have a revealment process. Okay, I mean, it's Big Brother is here, right? I mean, and so this is kind of a revealment process of us because I mean, us as individuals. I mean, what can we do? You know, as an individual person, because a lot of the psychological warfare, part of it is to get us to think that all we are is we're in it all on our own. We don't have government with us. We don't have our family with us. We don't have faith with us. And so, I don't know if it's part of a revealment process or something, but I tend not to trust things that get talked a lot about in the media because in our books, we bring some very revelatory things, and we have the media actively fight us and actively cover up what we are talking about in the books.
Are you familiar with the Michael Hastings story at all?
Yes, I am. Yes, I am.
You know, if the listeners don't know, I mean, he's the guy that broke these stories about some skullduggery in Afghanistan. General McChrystal led to him being removed from his command in Afghanistan, and Michael Hastings created a lot of enemies, of course. He had been telling his friends and colleagues in recent days that he was working on something very hot, something involving this lady, Jill Kelly, that socialite in Florida, who got chummy with a lot of intelligence and military folks, her relationship to the Department of Defense. Well, Michael Hastings, as we read earlier this week, died in this high-speed crash, single-vehicle crash in Southern California, 4:20 in the morning. People wondering whether he was killed somehow. Somebody took remote control of his vehicle and smashed it into a tree, or what the heck was going on? Any thoughts?
Well, looking into this stuff sometimes isn't good for people's health. I mean, you have Jim Keith, you have William Cooper, you have Danny Casolaro. You have a lot of people that have looked into things such as this and have met untimely demise.
You mentioned about the drug traffic. The guy at the San Jose Mercury, who I forget the name of the reporter, but the guy who...
Gary Webb. He shot himself twice in the head with a .38.
Twice?
Yes. Yes.
And he's the guy that reported about the CIA drug connection and the cocaine traffic?
Right. And but when you look at it I knew Gary and knew people around that story. And when you look at it very, very close, you find out that the story was leaked to him. Okay, out of the Department of Justice, okay? And so, again, and it was basically a message that was sent to the newsrooms that CIA drugs is a non-story. I mean, it's not going to help your career. It is not going to get published. We do an amazing book called A Terrible Mistake by Hank Albarelli. And here, again, it was a book that was with agents with New York for many, many years. And we had a gentleman by the name of Nat Hentoff, a big reporter of the Village Voice, Wall Street Journal. He wanted to do a story on the book. He was not allowed.
Well, I mean, is it your contention that these publishing houses are told don't publish X, Y, and Z, or that they just, or couldn't it just be that they figured that's not going to sell enough copies?
Oh, no. They're most of them are owned lock, stock, and barrel. I mean, I'm 63 some years old, and when I was a kid, most towns had 2, 3, if not 4 newspapers. There was, 100 some companies bringing us news. Now it's down to 5 or 6. And a lot of it has to do with slush funds that have been developed from World War II, having to do with gold, and then also with the drugs. And these slush funds allow, let's say we had 2 sugar companies, and we don't, but if we had 2 sugar companies and one sugar company was bringing in cocaine and the other one wasn't, which one's going to be around, It's simple economics. And these people out of the shadows, the secret societies, own these media, and they control what is being said through them.
Let's go back to secret societies, Skull and Bones. I remember hearing a lot about that during the Bush years, both Bush administrations, and a lot of attacks made using that information, the connection, the spooky connection. And I always thought of Skull and Bones as sort of like a fraternity, an excuse for guys to get together and get drunk and chase girls.
No, it's a classic secret society, and it's very powerful. Been very powerful for, Lord have mercy, almost 200 years. And, I mean, if you look at them today, the gentleman behind Sears and Kmart with a big bond, Eddie Lamprey, they own Blackstone, Federal Express. The Bush family, has created quite the political dynasty. They're very, very powerful.
And is it just Bush? It's not just a Republican thing. It's
you have John Kerry in there too. I mean, it was very interesting. When you had John Kerry versus Bush, basically, I was told to sit down and shut up because nobody wanted to hear about it. And you had a situation there where, for my money, I mean, they stole both those elections, and you had Kerry put up not very much of a fight. I mean, when you join Skull and Bones, one thing you do every Thursday night is you tell them all about your every sexual thought and escapade that you've ever had. I mean, it's blackmailable. A secret society. I don't care if it's here in the United States or in deepest Africa or Asia. They're always the same. You have an outside group, a lot of people in Masonic circles. They call them porch brethren. They're there for favors and whatnot. Then you have an administrative cadre, because at any organization at any given time, you have the people who turn the lights on and turn the lights off. And then you have the core group, and the core groups are always all related. Okay, the Skull and Bones is built around the Cabot family with a big strong subset of the Whitney family. And you have the core group then invites, say, the smart guy over at the Yale Lit, and then maybe the football captain. And then they have a party, and they say, hey, why don't you marry my sister? Okay, I mean, you look at John Kerry, all of his marriages all came from the Skull and Bones family.
David Brody is a leading researcher and lecturer in the field of the history of America before Columbus. A former director of the New England Antiquities Research Association, he has appeared frequently as a guest expert on documentaries airing on the History Channel, Travel Channel, PBS, and Discovery Channel. He's the author of 6 historical fiction novels. He's a graduate of Tufts University and Georgetown Law School. He's the author of a whole series of books dealing with the Pre-Columbian America, The Cult of Venus, Echoes of Atlantis, The Oath of Nimrod, Powdered Gold, The Thief on the Cross, Cabal of the Westford Knight, The Wrong Abraham, to name a few. Hey, David, welcome to Coast AM. How are you?
Richard, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm doing very well, thank you.
You've been on Coast before, but you and I have not talked on Coast. We've talked on my podcast, Conspiracy Unlimited. Would I be exaggerating to suggest that this whole pre-Columbian North American history is occupying a very huge space in your emotional and intellectual life?
You would not be exaggerating. To say that it keeps me up at night would be an understatement. We spent a really magical night last night at a site called America Stonehenge in New Hampshire, watching the summer solstice sunset. And I was up all night tossing and turning, just thinking of, there's so much of our history that we just don't know, that we're just scratching the surface of this. But that site is a magical site, and there's a number of other magical sites around New England, and they all have stories to tell. And, there's not enough time in any of our lives to get to the bottom of this. But thank goodness that people like yourself are willing to be open-minded so that researchers like myself can have a venue to talk about these things. Because I think it really is hidden history, and I think people really do have an interest in this, but first they have to be introduced to it. So, again, I'm really happy to be here tonight.
Why is it so important to you, first of all?
I'm not sure. Other than that, I have children myself, and I just feel like, our history is important. We have a right to know, and I'm not saying that necessarily there's a conspiracy out there to hide history from us. I don't think that's necessarily it. But the truth matters. We're in a stage now in our political environment where we always hear about fake news and whatever. The truth matters. Facts are stubborn things. And I just think it's important to finally get to the bottom of a lot of this.
North America, it seems to me, there seems to be, you say there's not a conspiracy. We can discuss that. But there seems to be almost this firewall around a certain chapter in our history. If you look at the history of every other place on the planet, they accept and they embrace the fact that there have been mass migrations and people moving back and forth, and the Celts and and yet here, it's like it's a no-go zone. Is it like, for you to dive into this arena, is it a little bit like kissing the third rail?
It really is. And last night I was with a group of people, as I mentioned, and one of the women was from Germany. And I just mentioned the name Christopher Columbus in passing, and she just rolled her eyes at me. And it struck me that people from Europe understand how silly that whole thing is, that he was the first person to, quote-unquote, discover America. Well, we know the Vikings were here before that, and probably waves of explorers long before that. But here in America, as kids, we all learn about the Tooth Fairy and the Easter Bunny, and then at some point, our parents sort of tell us the truth or we figure it out. And yet we all have this, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, fantasy in our heads, and for some reason, we never get past that. And like you said, there's a barrier, there's a blind spot. I'm not sure what it is, but it's one of those things from our childhood that we learn it in first or second grade, and it just stays with us. And the idea that maybe he wasn't first, it's almost like a faith thing more than an intellect. And once people get their brains wrapped around it, it's like, oh, well, of course, it makes perfect sense. But just getting there is hard, and that happens not just to the average citizen, but like you said, academia seems to have a real blind spot for this as well.
Is that why you decided to approach this whole arena in fiction in order to maybe do an end run around academia because it's more palatable?
It wasn't anything nearly that sophisticated. I'm a fiction writer. I'd written 3 novels, and I was writing what I thought was going to be a 4th legal thriller. That's the genre I was writing because I'm a lawyer by training. And my daughter came home from school one day in 4th grade, and we live in a town in Massachusetts, Westford, and we have the legend of the Westford Knight. And I had never heard of it, but she came home from school one day and said, Daddy, guess who discovered America before Columbus? And I said, oh, that's a fun legend, a fun story. Maybe I can incorporate that into my next legal thriller as one of those little, minor subplot type things. And so this was about 11 or 12 years ago, and so I went down that rabbit hole. And I have literally been ferreting around in the dark, dusty corners of history ever since. I'm in desperate need of a change of clothes and a shower. But, I'm still down there. And, of course, I never wrote that 4th legal thriller. Instead, it turned into what you called archaeological fiction. It's, historical fiction type stuff. But it wasn't an intentional desire to sort of approach this through the back door in any way. It just is the way things came about organically. But having said that, when you think about other, sort of books of this genre, when you think about the Da Vinci Code, for example, Holy Blood, Holy Grail was written before the Da Vinci Code in the nonfiction version, and some people read that, but most people did not. It wasn't until Dan Brown fictionalized it and popularized it that people started really paying attention to it. So I do think there's a much larger audience for these historical fiction type stories than there is just for the dry history books. Not many people read those after school. So I do think it's allowed me to reach a broader audience by cloaking these stories in a thrill ride and allowing people to be educated while they're being entertained. I do think it has opened the door to a lot more readership than I would have had otherwise.
The Knights Templar, we think of them as this military order that was guarding the the road for Christian pilgrims into the Holy Land and so forth, and guarding King Solomon's temple and so forth. But there was so much more than that. I'm fascinated by this whole. As I described earlier, they were almost the world's first multinational corporation.
Very much so. So let's set the stage a little bit. So we're talking about Europe just coming out of the Dark Ages. No one is literate other than the monks living in seclusion. Things have really, the Roman Empire falls and Europe just basically goes, again, back to the Dark Ages. There's really no education, there's no science, there's no literature. Whatever knowledge there is in the world basically is centered in the Middle East and Northern Africa. So the Templars, as you said, they go to Jerusalem as a way to guard the highways into Jerusalem to make sure the pilgrims weren't being robbed and whatnot. And once they get there, it must have been quite an eye-opening experience for them because that's where the center of knowledge was. And all these things that they had been oblivious to, they're starting to acquire knowledge, ancient knowledge, science, architecture, the arts, perhaps the ancient writings showing the true history of early Christianity, medicine, science. But these are things that they acquired before anyone else in Europe had them, and then they brought them all back. So part of the reason why they were so successful as being this multinational corporation, as you said, is they were just more educated, having spent time in the Middle East than the rest of Europeans. But they came back to a situation in Europe where the church was perfectly happy keeping things, keeping the peasants uneducated, making people believe that the only way to cure a disease was to pray and to give your money to the church and let the church pray for you, as opposed to using medicine. That was the competition. And so, in the end, we'll get to that, but in the end, the church and the Templars sort of butted heads, and the church outlawed them. And a large reason for that, I think, was because the Templars were trying to sort of modernize Europe, both in action and in thought, and the church was perfectly happy keeping things the way they used to be. The earth is flat, you need to pray for your health. They didn't like these new ideas, these newfangled ideas that the Templars were bringing back from Europe, from the Middle East to Europe.
They'd also amassed such a wealth that they were lending money like to the King of France, and he was so indebted to them that wasn't it the King of France who said,
"Get rid of your debt than to kill your banker"? That's
right,
in the end,
right.
That's the King of France proposed this, and the church was happy to go along with it because the Crusades were over and the Templars were well armed and well financed, and I think again butting heads spiritually with the church. And when the King of France came up with this idea to outlaw them, the church was like, "Yeah, that solves a lot of problems for us. Thank you. Go ahead. You have our permission to do that." And it's like outlawing the mafia. Just because you outlaw a group doesn't mean they go away. They just go underground, and we'll probably get to that later in this conversation, I'm sure. But they went underground. The Templars did, and resurrected themselves as various groups. And as you said, eventually made their way to North America, probably as a safe haven.
And when do you think they made that journey? Was it in the 14th century? Was it before?
Right. So it seems to me. I think that the most logical way to look at this is the Templars were outlawed. It was 1307. It was Friday the 13th of October, which is why Friday the 13th is unlucky. The King of France came in and raided their treasury, their headquarters in Paris, hoping to recover their treasures, and their treasures were gone. So one way to follow the money. Okay, where'd the money go? That's probably where the Templars went. And many historians believe that their treasure left from the port of La Rochelle on the western coast of France, the northwestern coast of France, and that the Templars ended up in Scotland because at that time Scotland was not under the jurisdiction of the Pope because Robert the Bruce, the Scottish leader, had been excommunicated, and so the Templars went to Scotland, a number of them, and sort of regathered and reconstituted themselves, and from there eventually made their way across later in the 14th century, I think, to Nova Scotia and then down to New England.
Ah, Nova Scotia. So of course, we have the mystery of Oak Island off the coast of Nova Scotia. Some people think that the treasure there is Knights Templar treasure. Some think it's pirate plunder, perhaps Bluebeard. I mean, is there solid archaeological evidence or documentation that leads you to suspect that the treasure at Oak Island might be Knights Templar treasure?
So there's a fascinating set of journals that were discovered 2 summers ago, June of 2016. A woman came into the local museum here in Westford, which is, again, in Massachusetts where I live, and it was a Sunday afternoon, and I didn't happen to be on duty that day, but she came in, and she claimed to have journals from the Sinclair family going back to the 14th century. The Sinclairs are a leading Scottish family. In the 15th century, the Sinclairs built the famous Rosslyn Chapel. Going back earlier, they were closely affiliated with the Knights Templar, and going forward, they were closely affiliated with Scottish Rite Freemasonry, being the hereditary Grand Masters for about 200 years. So this is very important. Oh, and in the Da Vinci Code and Holy Blood, Holy Grail, they are named as a possible bloodline family. So their name pops up whenever you do this kind of research. So this woman claimed to have journals from the mid-14th century to the late 18th century from the Sinclair family, and that these journals essentially recounted their journey across the North Atlantic to North America in 1398, Nova Scotia and New England, but also an earlier journal in the 1360s or 70s, sort of a preliminary journey. I think I said journal, preliminary journey. And so what's fascinating about these journals is that they talk about bringing treasures to an island off the coast of Nova Scotia, and that later, in the 1770s, family members who are now living in the United States went up there to retrieve the treasures that were being sort of safeguarded by the Freemasons and brought those treasures back and were used to fund the American Revolution. So we have this whole thing about the Sinclairs and the Templars coming across and leaving their treasures in Nova Scotia, and then these treasures end up being taken away for the funding of the American Revolution, which is just a fascinating possibility.
Fascinating. It sounds like it's right at a national treasure with Nicolas Cage. I mean, they didn't actually even burn them at the stake. I mean, they slow roasted them. Pretty gruesome stuff.
Yeah, the leaders, yeah. They were really intent on extracting some confessions. And it may, what they were accused of was heresy, basically. And it may be that the Templars were practicing sort of an alternative version of Christianity, an unorthodox version. Again, because of what they learned in the Middle East, I think that they became exposed to, the ideas reflecting the importance of a female aspect of the Godhead, duality of the Godhead, things that the Gnostics of France and in the Albigensian Crusade were slaughtered for earlier in the 12th century. And so I think that they really were running afoul of the church from a doctrinal point of view. And that was one of the things that led to their downfall. But I think the church was intent on getting some kind of extraction and admission that they were worshiping an unchristian version of Christianity, I guess you would say.
Right. So the idea that not only were they venerating the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus, but also Mary Magdalene. And one of the images that we have posted up at coasttocoastam.com in the slide carousel that you've provided is this image of a pregnant Mary Magdalene. Right.
So this is the image that I posted there. It doesn't show the what's at. She said she's at the bottom of a cross. At the top of the cross is Jesus, being crucified, and she's at the bottom, and she's very clearly pregnant. And this is from a Cistercian monastery in Spain in the 13th century. So I always like to say that whether Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married and had children or not, it almost doesn't really matter. What matters is what people of medieval time period believed, because it's beliefs that motivate behavior, and it's beliefs that motivate the behavior that changes history. And so the Cistercians, who were the sister order to the Knights Templar, apparently believed in the Mary Magdalene Jesus union and the fact that she had his child. And there's plenty of examples of this kind of artwork scattered around Europe. And so I think that's one of the things that the Templars believed, again, they're being the sister order to the Cistercians. It's one of the things that they believed that obviously put them at loggerheads with the church, the idea that Jesus, as a Jewish rabbi, which is what he was expected to marry and have children, as all rabbis at that time were expected to do. And that at the time he was crucified, she was either pregnant or already had a child or whatever, and that's whole bloodline thing that we learned so much about through the Da Vinci Code. But obviously the church wasn't happy with that. And so I think one of the things that we see, and this is where I've spent 12 years looking at the Templars and their motivations for coming to America, and I keep stumbling upon this over and over again, this idea that they were worshiping and venerating a feminine version of the Godhead, that they wasn't just the Virgin Mary, but the Virgin Mary was very important to them as well, but also Mary Magdalene.
Now, was it a confession that they were trying to get, to sort of renounce this worship in the goddess or the female godhead, as you say, or is it possible that they were looking for information as to where they were sort of squirreling away all of their wealth? Because it wasn't, like we tend to think from National Treasure that it was artifacts and gold and all of these, but mainly it was their wealth was, from what I understand, it was buildings and land and loans and this sort of thing.
Right. So I agree, and it wasn't just that too. I mean, it was definitely that. It was definitely gold and silver. It was definitely buildings and land. But even more, I think, than that was ancient knowledge, the ability, like the understanding of how to do the architecture that allowed for these flying buttresses and the soaring Gothic churches that we had. That all came back from the knowledge that the Templars acquired. But then there's also this idea that they acquired in the Middle East ancient relics, whether it be the Ark of the Covenant or the Holy Grail or the cross that Jesus was crucified on. So there's all these ancient relics. There's also and I mentioned these journals that we came across about 2 years ago from the Sinclair family. There's another set of journals that are sort of bouncing around that came out of war-torn Italy post-World War II, and these journals document a journey by the Templars in 1179 across the Atlantic. And a dear friend of mine by the name of Zena Halpern wrote a book about this about a year ago called The Templar Mission to Oak Island and Beyond. She just recently passed away, unfortunately, but some of your listeners may recognize her from being on The Curse of Oak Island with the Regina brothers. But these journals that Zena ended up with, they talk about this journey in 1179 across the Atlantic. And, they talk about how the Templars were coming even then to bring treasures that they had acquired in Jerusalem earlier in the 11th century. And they were bringing these treasures across to North America. And one of the things that is written about in those journals is the marriage contract, the ketubah, between, and I quote here, the Hasmonean princess Mary of Migdal and Yeshua ben Joseph. So basically the marriage contract between Mary Magdalene and Jesus is one of the things that Templars may have brought over here in the 12th century. So, clearly it's not just gold and silver, as you said. There's other things at play here, and clearly the church would have liked to have gotten their hands on those kinds of things. And then one of the reasons why the Templars brought them here is because out of reach. It was if they brought them any place in Europe, the church is going to ferret them out probably.
You mentioned
a stopover in Iceland and then eventually to North America, from what I understand.
Right. You mentioned, David, the Knights Templar, how they perhaps bankrolled the American War of Independence.
Right.
What is the connection between the Knights Templar, the Freemasons, and then can we maybe explore the possibility that the idea of the United States is, it's been described as sort of a Masonic plot, but is it, was it a creation of the Knights Templar?
I think that's almost an inescapable conclusion. So if you talk to high-level Freemasons, and I'm not a Freemason, but I do spend a lot of time at lodges giving lectures.
You wouldn't tell me if you were.
I'm sorry, what was that?
You wouldn't tell me if you were.
Well, one of the reasons why I'm not, and I do have a lot of respect for what they do, but it would prevent me from talking about my research. If I figure something out on my own, I can talk about it. If I acquire that knowledge through a lodge ceremony, I'm sworn to secrecy. So this allows me to have these conversations without being constrained in any way. But it seems almost inescapable to me that when the Templars were outlawed, they reconstituted themselves, and I strongly believe they became the Freemasons. Like, it may not have been as clear a path as some historians say, but clearly there's a continuity there. There's a thread that continues. And just you look no further than the Sinclair family to see that evidence of that, both going backwards to the early creation of the Templars and then going forward afterwards, as I said, as being the hereditary Grand Masters of Scottish Rite Freemasonry. So there's this huge continuum, I think. And so then, what are the things that were important to the Templars and then also the Freemasons? We talk about things like liberty, freedom of religion, a lot of the things that the Founding Fathers based our country on. And so, and you look at the number of Freemasons who signed the Declaration of Independence and were involved in powerful positions in government at that time. It's almost inescapable, which is why those journal entries that talked about how the treasures that were buried up in Nova Scotia, perhaps at Oak Island, were used to fund the American Revolution are so intriguing. It's not something I'd ever heard before, and I should state, by the way, we're not sure that these journals are even authentic. We're still trying to vet them out. But just the idea, it makes sense. It's like, yeah, that does sound like what would have happened. Just because, as you said, the beliefs, the value set, the things that were important to the Templars and then the Freemasons and then our Founding Fathers, there was a commonality there. And also, by the way, I should add, that's why the Templars, when they came over here, were able to create an alliance with a lot of the Native American tribes, because they did come in peace, and they did come and respect the native culture, and they weren't here to rape and pillage and take advantage. And so we have to look at that aspect of it as well. But there is a more than a grain of truth to what you said there, Richard. I do think you're onto something with that.
Well, when we think of the idea of American exceptionalism, and we often hear things like, America was to be the New Jerusalem, which is really what the Templars were trying to establish, right?
That's exactly the term, the New Jerusalem. And so, clearly that has a religious connotation to it, a Christian connotation. And it's sort of ironic that we ended up with, the Puritans, who were probably some of the most repressive religious groups in history. That the whole idea of they came here for freedom of religion, but of course once they got here, it had to be their religion only, and then people eventually left the Bay Colony to go found Rhode Island, because Rhode Island ended up being sort of the bastion of freedom of religion. But it's ironic to think that the Puritans, again, who were the most repressive, were sort of the Founding Fathers or the early Pilgrims, and clearly we came a long way between then and the American Revolution. But I think you're right to connect the dots with those groups. I think you're onto something there.
Let's talk about some of the images that Sean Ladisor has posted up at coasttocoastam.com and the slide carousel, and that are reported to be sort of the fingerprints of the Knights Templar in America, and one not too far from you in Rhode Island, and that's the Newport Tower. Tell us about that.
Right. Just a fascinating structure. So my research reveals, and my belief is that the tower was built right around 1400 by the Sinclair family. Prince Henry Sinclair, we think, came basically island hopping his way across the North Atlantic, much as the Vikings did 300 years or 400 years earlier. Ended up in Nova Scotia, spent the winter with the Mi'kmaq tribe, and then continued down the coast to New England. He ended up in Westford, Massachusetts. There's a Westford knight carving, a carving of a medieval knight that marks a fallen comrade of Sinclair's, that is still visible today. And then they continued down to Rhode Island and built the tower. And if your viewers can see the tower, they know the tower. It's a round stone tower in Romanesque style. It's on 8 pillars with archways in between the pillars. It looks nothing like anything you've ever seen in colonial architecture. The traditional historians tell us that this was built as a windmill somewhere between 1675 and 1677 by the governor of Rhode Island at the time by the name of Benedict Arnold, who's the great-grandfather of the great Benedict Arnold. And the story goes that in 1675, the existing windmill in Rhode Island burned down, and Governor Arnold built this instead. None of it makes any sense. The story doesn't make sense. Structurally, it's incredibly poor design for a windmill. You want to have a solid base. This would not be able to withstand the lateral forces of a wind shear. It makes no sense that way. It makes no sense to build anything in stone at that time period. If you go to a place called Plymouth Plantation in Massachusetts, which is sort of representation of life during the 1670s, everything is in wood because life was still too transitory. And more to the point, that 1675 to 1677 time period was a Native American uprising, a very vicious and severe Native American uprising called King Philip's War, Metacomet's War. And during that time period, approximately a third of the New England villages and towns were at risk. And so to think that the colonists in Rhode Island would have built a stone windmill as opposed to a stone fort during that time period is ludicrous. There's just no reason they would have done it during that time period. They were just trying to survive. The unit of measurement to build that edifice is a Scottish L. There's no reason why the colonists would have used anything besides the foot. It'd be like if you hired a contractor today and asked them to use a Scottish L to build you a house, they wouldn't have any idea how to do it. It just makes no sense. There's a fireplace on the second floor, and anybody who knows anything about grain and gristing mills, you can't have a flame anywhere nearby. So why would you put a fireplace in your grist mill? That makes no sense. The fireplace flue is a double flue, sort of in the style of devil's horns, and that's a feature unique to 14th century Scotland. We've done some carbon dating at the tower, found a seashell, which was used to make ancient lime back in the day, and it carbon dated to 1430, plus or minus. And so there's lots of data points and just basic logic and common sense that scream out that this is earlier than colonial. It's not colonial. And at the same point, a lot of the intersection points sort of point to 14th century Scotland, which again is why we think late 1300s, early 1400s, this tower was probably built by the Scottish explorers who were the remnants of the Knights Templar, the disbanded Knights Templars. And again, coming over here for the reasons we discussed earlier, find a safe haven, to get a foothold, to get away from the church, to hide their treasures.
And what about Henry St. Clair himself, the Earl of Orkney? Was he perhaps involved in the construction of this tower?
Yeah, I think he's. If there had to be one person that we can say sort of, quarterbacked this whole operation, it's important to remember that although he was the Earl of Orkney and the Baron of Roslin, that's the Roslin side is on his father's side of the family, but his mother was a Norse woman, and that's where he gets the Orkney Islands. And so he grew up in a family where his mother was Norse, and she would have had oral history and probably maps and charts of the old Viking explorers coming across the North Atlantic. And I always thought as a kid, we know about Leif Erikson and the voyages back and forth to Vinland in the early parts of the 11th century, and then all of a sudden the historical timeline, there's a big 500-year gap between Leif Erikson and Christopher Columbus. I remember being a second grader, raising my hand and saying, Mrs. North, why did no one come back for those 500 years? And she looked at me and she said, David, they probably did, but they kept it secret because they had a really good thing going economically. They were not only trading with the natives and fishing, but they were most importantly harvesting timber. And if you're a seafaring society like the Vikings were, the most important thing is you need timber to build your large ships. And Scandinavia at that point was becoming deforested. And so, think about Maine and Nova Scotia and what a heavenly place that would have been if you needed timber for your ships. But also, like a favorite fishing hole, they would have kept it secret, so they wouldn't have kept records of that. So sort of a long way of saying, I think Henry St. Clair, as part of having a Norse background, would have known about this path across the North Atlantic, would have known how to get there, would have known where to go would have probably had old maps and charts. And so we know he had a fleet of ships. We know he was the one who brought the bishop to Greenland on behalf of the Pope. We know he'd gone at least that far. There's lots of evidence that he had some admirals from Venice, the Zeno brothers, who sailed ships for him. So there's lots of sort of circumstantial evidence that you could put together to build a very strong case that he's the one who led this expedition in 1398, 1399 to New England.
Well, maybe this is part of the suppression, you see. We'll have to cancel all of the Columbus Day parades, and now it'll be the Earl of Orkney Day, which doesn't quite roll off the tongue the same way. Maybe that's part of the reticence to embrace this.
Secret societies, the search for the Holy Grail, the white powder of gold, Solomon's treasure. What a night this is going to be. I feel like Nicolas Cage, National Treasures. No, up next, Sir Lawrence Gardner on Coast to Coast AM. Sir Lawrence Gardner, constitutional historian, genealogist, broadcaster. He's a presidential attaché to the European Council of Princes. In Scotland, he's the prior of the Sacred Kindred of St. Columbia and a Knight Templar of St. Anthony. His writing career is in collaborative projects with national institutions such as the British Tourist Authority, the Government of Ontario, the Russian Ministry of Culture. Dr. Lawrence Gardner is a top 10 nationally acclaimed author internationally as well, with published works in many languages. Lawrence Gardner back on Coast to Coast. Hey, Lawrence, how are you?
Hello there, George. Good to be back.
Always
and
a
I'm
pleasure.
Well, thanks, and you?
I call you Sir Lawrence, or have I knighted you?
No, Lawrence is fine.
I love it. How have you been?
I've been good. It's been a while since I've been on, isn't it? A couple of years, I think. Or
yes.
Near enough.
It's coming up to actually, it's coming up on 3 years.
Is it?
Too long.
My God.
You were on May of 2005 with me.
Time flies.
It sure does. Of course, I met you at a conference with Bill Henry a year and a half ago, maybe? Remember that one?
Yeah, I was over in L.A., wasn't I?
Yes, you were.
Yes, that's correct, yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Absolutely. Well, lots to talk with you about today. Your latest work, The Shadow of Solomon. Let's go back a little bit, though. Let's talk about the Grail bloodline, because it has a lot to do with some of the things we're going to talk about tonight. You know, it's been years now with this Da Vinci Code and the furor over that. Has that died down at all?
Well, interestingly, no. I mean, it was 2003 when the book came out, and then the fever began, and then it was 2006 we had the movie, and that boosted it all again, and on a worldwide basis it became one of the biggest things ever. I mean, it was the biggest selling hardback book of all time for whatever reason. And I had an idea at that time that what would happen was that it would probably sort of kill off the real interest, because it had become novelized, it had become fantastic in many ways, and I just figured it would die down. But what actually happened was quite the opposite. It stirred an interest, but it wasn't just an interest in the entertainment factor, it was a real interest in the subject. And lots of people started to email me and call me via people that I knew to ask questions, and a lot had actually noted and noticed discrepancies in Dan Brown's story as against what had been published over the years on the subject, and they wanted to know where the fact was and where the fiction was, where the two met, where they differed. Mm-hmm. And so I became sort of overwhelmed, particularly after the film. And it seemed to ignite a fuse of extra interest. And in fact, the readership potential just broadened considerably in the non-fiction market. And that led my publisher and I to sort of get our heads together, and they said, well, look, you know, why not try and answer some of these questions that you haven't answered in your previous book? How about having another go at it? Because it's 12 years since Bloodline of the Holy Grail came out. That was published for me in 1996. So I thought, okay, and I went back to base, and what I knew was that when Bloodline was first published, there was a heck of a lot of information that I had that right. Never got into the book anyway. I mean, the book was really sort of constrained. It covered such an enormous span of time, 2,000 years of history in Bloodline of the Holy Grail. So I thought, well, what I'll do, I'll write a completely new book, and I'll just tie it to the first few hundred years. I won't go back beyond the Jesus Gospel period the other way, and I won't come really much beyond about the year 600 AD the other way. And I'll just put into it everything that I've got about that 600 years. And that, as against 2,000 years in the other book, ended up being a book of exactly the same size. So that comes out now on March the 3rd. It's entitled The Grail Enigma. And so just a couple of weeks now, and we're due for release.
Oh, my gosh, we're just talking about one here that I just got done reading, The Shadow of Solomon.
Yes, they come thick and fast.
They do. You're quite prolific when it comes to that.
Yeah, actually, Solomon's been out for a while. It just took a little while to get into America.
Right.
You know, sometimes that happens. I never quite know what the time gap is going to be between the UK release at this end and the American release. It depends on what deal the publishers do, you know. And so with The Grail Enigma, I'm not sure when that'll be in the States. Actually, it's coming out in the UK in 2 weeks' time, but the United States version will follow.
Let's go back, Lawrence, if we can, to the period of King Solomon. And we've heard so much about King Solomon's treasure in the first movie, National Treasure, with Nicolas Cage. We saw, of course, the fictional Solomon's treasure hidden away. Let's go back to that era, if we can, and if you would just tell us a little bit about this king, what happened to him, what happened to the treasure.
Yes, well, forgetting Nicolas Cage, of course.
Yeah.
And who knows? There still might be some treasure out there for Nicolas Cage to find. You know, one doesn't know that. I mean, the importance of King Solomon seems to be that in biblical terms, you know, once the kingship of Judah and Israel had begun under King David, and we're looking at about 1000 BC, that sort of period, that Solomon seems to be one of the most written about. And remember, all of the writings about the kings were done in retrospect and in hindsight, you know, some long time afterwards, 200 years afterwards, but they sort of settled on King Solomon as being something really, really special. And we really only got the Bible to go on here. There's not a lot about King Solomon outside the Bible which doesn't use it as a base for its information. So, you know, we don't know what the ultimate truths and strengths of it all are. But he became famed in the first place because he built the first Temple of Jerusalem, and I suppose that was the sort of main claim to fame. But what did seem to happen was that from being the son of a king who was a warlord, I suppose David was a military leader, essentially, Solomon seemed to establish a basis for what became known as kingship. And so he wasn't a great warrior, it didn't seem. He became a judicial type of king, but he was enormously wealthy. Enormously. I mean, when one reads through what is said about his wealth, I mean, the amount of gold that he seemed to have was incredible.
And how did he amass that, Lawrence?
Well, it's impossible to know. I mean, we have stories and things like King Solomon's mines that come off of it, postulating theories. We know that certain kings of other regions were supplying Solomon with a lot of things, with ships, with chariots, with horses.
Were they buying him off? Were they afraid of him?
Well, no. I mean, he seemed. It seemed to be in exchange for this sort of knowledge and judgmental quality that he had, and clearly what he was doing. I mean, and this is probably the real basis of it. That this land of Canaan, as it used to be, had sort of become consolidated under him, and it's a pretty large, tract of land within that region. It sort of sat then with Phoenicia up on the coast and the Jordan lands down below and whatever, and he was hanging and holding it all together. And this clearly was very, very valuable for the kings of the surrounding countries. And so money and supplies were coming into him from Jordan, from Phoenicia, from the Yemen, various places. Even the Queen of Sheba was said to have come and brought him a camel train with all sorts of goodies and spices, and again, gold. And the whole thing seems to center on gold. There was a heck of a lot of gold coming in. And the temple itself, when you read the descriptions of it, and again, we don't know how real these are, but just a few hundred years after his time, it was being written that just about everything in the damn place was covered in gold, and even the shields on the walls were made of gold. And so what we actually have here is a king who, whether in reality or whether simply in terms of boosting him historically, was very famous, very rich, and judgmentally quite a brilliant king, it seems. The big problem that he had in terms of biblical law, of course, was that what he did was to upset the religious establishment quite a lot, because he had loads of wives, apparently. They all belonged to tribes that had different gods and goddesses. So he didn't really sort of hook into the one God thing that the Bible story is about. And that got him a bit of a bad name, but it also made him very fascinating. And as rebels do in history, that people sort of latch onto them. And from then on, going down through history, he seems to have been looked upon as some sort of a model of kingship. And, one can move into France in the Middle Ages, right up to that time. And they're still talking about trying to make their kingship like that of King Solomon. When we study documents of the Scientific Royal Society in Britain here, Isaac Newton wrote in the late 1600s that he felt that in terms of acquisition of knowledge, that we were all living in the shadow of Solomon. And that's why I called my book The Shadow of Solomon. It came from Isaac Newton.
When the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, didn't they have some reference to King Solomon in some incredible treasure that it didn't go into, but it did speculate on the fact that there was something massive tucked away somewhere?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. This comes up time after time, and it's what the legends are based on. And maybe they're not legendary. Maybe there is a great treasure out there somewhere. Who knows? I don't know how many people have ever looked for it, or if they would know where to look for it. But quite frankly, if he did have a treasure, it would seem to me that it probably wasn't very far from him. And, he had the Temple of Jerusalem. He had all of the underground vaults there. Now, in the 1870s, engineers from Britain and the Palestine Exploration Fund dug down into those vaults. And they found all sorts of bits and pieces and interesting things. But what they found quite fascinating was that they found quite a few Templar items, broken Templar swords, broken Templar crosses, things like that, from the Middle Ages. So what they knew at that time was that these vaults had been excavated before, and history has always said, and it's been regarded as legendary by some, but one way or another, the stories have always been there about how the Templars, whilst they were in Jerusalem, soon after they were founded, in fact, in the very early 1100s, they were digging away beneath the Temple Mount. And once they left Jerusalem in 1127 and were called back to Europe, Bernard de Clairvaux, the abbot, the Cistercian abbot, who was their patron and protector, had to get armies to ride with them through Europe. And in fact, what he said was that it was to make sure that the ecclesiastical bodies got nowhere near what they were carrying. So clearly what they were bringing back was something pretty important, something very valuable, that the Pope and the Church would have been after at the time.
Could it have been the Ark of the Covenant?
Well, yes, it could have been. I mean, it could have been all sorts of things. And in fact, the Ark does come up once or twice in Templar history once they're back in France. Certainly in relation to Chartres Cathedral.
What happened? Let's go back to Solomon for a moment. What happened to him?
He died.
I mean, did he get wiped out by someone else? Did he get attacked?
No, he died. He lived a long time, and he reigned for 40 years, the Bible tells us. But on the other hand, it tells us that just about everybody reigned for 40 years. It was the standard.
It also rained for 40
days.
Well,
it wasn't really a length of reign. It was actually the generational standard. 40 years was reckoned to be the generational
term, right?
standard between a father and his son. I mean, I think the age now is about 30 for generational standards, but it was 40 years then for kingly dynasties. And so it was always reckoned that the son would be born when the father was 40, and whether the father was still reigning or not, that's when the son would effectively become king. So everybody seemed to reign for 40 years. But no, he died in the end. I mean, there was no big deal about it. It was nothing special, and he didn't seem to get very involved in battles or anything of that sort. He just liked his women and his fineries and his luxuries, and ruled his kingdom with an iron fist, it would seem, but was seemingly liked by the majority.
Don't you think if he had this treasure, it would have been pillaged by that time, after he died?
I mean, I think a lot would have been. It's a very strange history, that place. I mean, you've got King Solomon's temple. Then in later times, you've got various people assaulting it. The temple gets destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar in about 586, that sort of period BC. Total destruction then. It gets rebuilt again some years later. Syrians then attack it, and other people attack it, the Assyrians from Mesopotamia. Eventually along comes King Herod, and he enlarges it considerably, so we have a sort of a third temple, and ultimately, that disappears and gets destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. And so what we have is a sequence of buildings and collapses and rebuildings and extensions on the same place, and then in the end, it gets taken over by Islam, and the mosque is built on the site, as it's still there now, Al-Aqsa Mosque, and so it becomes a holy site of Islam as well as Christianity, as well as Judaism, and everybody claims it, everybody wants it. In terms of its treasure, or what might have been stored beneath it. Again, we've got very little other than the Bible to go on in the early times, but there's nothing in there about Nebuchadnezzar when he raided it, or his armies raided the temple in 586 BC, about them. It claims that he carried off the pillars and brazen lavers and all sorts of various bits and pieces, but it doesn't mention the Ark of the Covenant.
So I would have thought that Nebuchadnezzar may have brought back this treasure to Iraq, modern-day Iraq, and it's hidden away there somewhere.
Well, yes. It's just that, it's not listed. What's listed are a lot of very exciting things, but nothing that would relate to it being an enormous treasure.
Right.
Valuable nonetheless, but...
could it have been blown up?
Again, in Roman times, there's stories of the looting that went on then, and again, a listing of things that were taken, even in the Roman archives. But again, nothing of any enormous value. I mean, the sort of treasure one would expect to pick up from any palace anywhere, or any temple anywhere, but nothing tremendous. So if Solomon had treasure that was buried somewhere, then either it wasn't buried there, or those that were looting at the time in those early days didn't get it. And then, of course, we have the sort of unknown factor of the Templars in the 1200s, knowing that they brought back something enormous. I mean, it was described as so valuable that it basically overturned the financial structure of the whole of Europe. So clearly they came back with a heck of a lot.
They had something.
Yeah.
Some believe that some of Solomon's treasure might be in North America, hidden away.
Yes, I mean, they do, and I can't possibly dispute that. I mean, who knows? The thing is that if that is the case, then the reason that people must know that or think that they know that is because they must have some knowledge of something that I've never read about when it was found and taken there. I mean, I simply don't know that.
The Templars, the Freemasons, were they set up because of Solomon's treasure, or were they set up for other reasons, Lawrence?
I suppose we have to begin with the Templars because they were much earlier than Freemasons. What actually happened was that when the Crusaders were out in Jerusalem at the end of the 1000s, from about 1096, they were being led by a guy called Godfrey de Bouillon, who established out there quite quickly various knightly orders, one of them being the Order of the Temple of Jerusalem. And so the Templar beginnings were quite early, around about 1100, that sort of time. They were set up within Jerusalem. They grew quite quickly in number, but to start with, there probably weren't too many. And history tells us that they were established for no other purpose but to protect the roads for the pilgrims and that sort of thing.
They were soldiers in the beginning, right?
Oh, well, they were nobility, rather than I mean, they became soldiers, and I guess the nobility.
But they were armed. They had swords.
Men, but they were armed. They were a military unit.
Yes.
But essentially, what happened was that they were formed really more as a sort of ambassadorial team to begin. A lot of very strange things were going on out there at the time, and people were being slaughtered in the streets, and nobody really knew who was who. There were Jews there were Christians there were Muslims there, and they'd all been living pretty well together until a whole load of different sort of Muslims came in from Turkey and took over the whole the whole thing. And basically the Crusades were out there to make sure that Jerusalem was taken back from these Turks, but not necessarily from the Muslims, because the Muslims that have been living there before had been doing so quite peacefully, and there was no problem. But what happened, of course, was that the Crusaders didn't have a clue who was who. They didn't know one Muslim from another. They didn't know who was from that country, who was from Iraq, who was from Egypt, who was from Turkey. And so it kind of went wrong, and there was a lot of unnecessary slaughter going on or whatever. And so the Templars, in the first instance, appeared to be a sort of diplomatic unit that were trying to be diplomats in this environment, negotiating between the various leaders and this sort of thing. However, it didn't take very long after the death of Godfrey de Bouillon and King Baldwin took the throne in Jerusalem, when the Templars were actually set up in effectively what had been the headquarters of the king at that time, and he moved off into the place which is the Rock of David now, with the big dome on it. So he left them in this place which was effectively the palace.
Yeah, how many do you think were there? 100, 1,000?
Do we know? It's not possible to say. I mean, I think we're talking about a couple of dozen, something like that.
That's
probably.
all. Okay.
I think so at that stage. I mean, there's no indication that there were loads and loads of them, because when they came back to Europe, they had to have an army to protect them. So they clearly weren't that big as a military number. But what happened was that they were left there in this palace, which was on the site of the old temple. And we're looking at that date round about 1118. And they then spent from that date until 1127 seemingly doing nothing much else but digging. Their whole job seemed to be to stay there in this place where they were quartered and just to keep digging and excavating.
And they were doing all the work, or they had helpers?
Well, clearly they had helpers and people that came in, but I mean, they were doing the work. I mean,
right.
That's the way it reads.
And where did the Templars come from? I mean, were they Arabs? Were they
No,
Jews?
they were Flemish and French mainly.
Okay.
Yeah, mainly French mainly, and some from Flanders in there as well. But they were basically nobility, people related to one another by different birth strains, some church-based people. I mean, in those times, the key abbots, they were linked up entirely to the Cistercian order.
They must have thought that they got the short end of the stick if they got pushed out to the area of the world instead of staying in France or England or.
Well, I mean, the whole crusade was based on the knights and the nobility going out to lead these crusades.
Yeah.
I mean, when that lot had finished, out when King Richard of England and started his crusade later on, everybody wanted to be in on it. Everybody wanted to win Jerusalem for the Christians by then. But to start with, the First Crusade wasn't about winning it for the Christians. It was simply about getting these invaders out of a place that had been pretty peaceful.
Right, okay.
But anyway, this digging all sort of goes on for this period of time. And then the next bit of the story that we get is that in 1127, back they come to Europe. They're instructed by the papal legate to convene a council in January, it was of the following year, of 1128. Famous council when, in fact, they were then formally constituted into a knightly order, which prior to that had only been a sort of temporary arrangement. But the story gets ever stranger because at that stage of their history, they were suddenly enormously powerful. They started loaning money to just about every crown in Europe. The Pope decreed that they actually had an autonomous status, that they effectively, as a unit, as an order, had state status. So they were their own state. They were responsible to nobody, to no king. Their only superior was the Pope, and that was okay for them at the time because the Pope was a Cistercian, and they were linked to the Cistercian monastic order. They were military monks, effectively.
Mm-hmm.
And
well trained.
The legend grew from there. They became probably the most powerful institution that the world has ever seen.
And very wealthy.
Enormously wealthy, yeah.
Where did they get their money?
Well, it began, it seems, with what they brought back.
They found something.
Oh, they found tons. I mean, what they brought back from the temple was said, I mean, the words that were used at the time, the writings that we get, simply state it was an incredible storehouse. Words of that sort.
That could have been Solomon's treasure.
Oh, well, that's correct. That's the way it's portrayed as being, and we presume that it probably was. Whether it was all of it or some of it, we don't know. We haven't a clue. But what they came back with was an enormous volume of wealth. And from then on, what happened was that just about everybody who was anybody wanted to join the order. And the rules for joining the order were, I mean, to start with, you had to be of some sort of noble birth.
Okay.
I think it got a bit slacker later on, but to start with, and to join the order, what you had to do was to give up all your property and land and estates to the order.
Okay.
So you had to give away everything to belong to it.
Sounds like a cult.
Well, yeah, but what happened was that being part of it meant that you became enormously influential, very powerful, and were clearly on a darn good salary or whatever they did.
I mean, Lawrence, did they have the old musketeer line, too? All for one, one for all? Did they band together? Were they close? Did they take care of each other?
I would have thought so, yeah. I would have thought they would have to, actually, because they had plenty of enemies as well as friends. I mean, once you get into a situation like they were in, I mean, there was hardly a throne in Europe or the Levant that didn't owe them money. And so they were actually more powerful than the kings after a while. They moved from being ambassadors to basically becoming prime ministers and presidents.
Did they become almost like the bankers of the world?
They did.
All right.
Yes. I mean, they invented the checkbook system, and all of this sort of thing came out of those Templar times in the Middle Ages.
Amazing. The checkbook in those days?
Yeah, promissory notes.
Uh-huh.
They brought in a system of writing notes to the other person money, and they would guarantee to back it, just as banks do now, exactly the same. They introduced that. They introduced the sort of early insurance policy. I mean, this idea of insuring things and whatever. They began that then. Just about everything that happened in the banking world, they invented at that time. However, what they said was that they didn't invent it. It was what had actually been going on in Jerusalem and the land around when they got there.
They learned from that.
They learned from it and improved the system, yeah.
Well, then somewhere along the line, they crossed somebody or they got too wealthy because somebody wanted to disband them, right?
Oh, yes.
And kill them and crush them.
They became enormously powerful. And the king who was most concerned about this was Philip IV of France. And
well, he was heavily in debt to them, wasn't he?
Well, he was enormously in debt to them, but so were others. The thing was that to be able to move against the Templars, you had to have the Pope on your side. And Philip didn't have the Pope on his side. The Pope at the time was mysteriously murdered. And another Pope was brought in, who was actually a friend of King Philip's.
Isn't that convenient?
That's very convenient, yeah. And so it seems that between them, and this is how the story goes, although it's actually changed in recent times, this story, but the story was that from that moment, the Pope and King Philip set up this persecution of the Templars, and we're now in 1306, moving into 1307, and in that year of 1307, the big day came, and all the Templars were rounded up and were fleeing all over the place, and they ended up being tortured and burnt and whatever. But the interesting thing recently is that just a few years ago, and in fact the Vatican have published the actual facsimile documents within the last few weeks, just a few years ago, a document was discovered in the Vatican secret archive that nobody knew about before. And it was actually, this particular Pope, Pope Clement V, it was actually a letter from him to King Philip, telling him that he wanted nothing to do with any of it, and that Philip was to leave the Templars alone.
A little late, though.
Well, no, it wasn't. I mean, we're late discovering it, but what happened was that Philip ended up taking absolutely no notice of the Pope at all. So although he'd put this guy in position as his ally, and history has always recorded that the Pope led this persecution of the Templars, what we're learning now is that he didn't. And even when they were in captivity, he was explaining that they shouldn't be tortured and whatever, and of course they were being tortured. So King Philip seems to be not a particularly nice guy, and it all led in the end to the execution of Jacques de Molay, which was effectively the end of the Templars, although it wasn't. It was simply the end of the Templars in France. I mean, very many of them died, and very many of them just disappeared, and we never heard of them again. But 18 of their galleys, loaded with all sorts of goodness knows what, sailed from La Rochelle on the French coast, and some went to Portugal, and some went to Scotland. So we know those two things, and we know what happened to them in Portugal and in Scotland. And in fact, interestingly, out of all of the supposed Templar orders worldwide that there are only 3 in the whole of the world that are recognized by statute even today, and they are in Portugal and Scotland.
Well, that's a great story to build up to, of course, Freemasonry, as we're going to get into that pretty soon. But with these Templars, they're disbanded. Yet you say, though, that some of them were still around in other regions of the world at that time.
Yes.
What about their wealth?
Well, the wealth supposedly
dissipated.
No. It's really interesting, and this is where the story of the Ark of the Covenant comes in. Their center was the chapter house of the Treasury in Paris, and the majority of their wealth, because if they were a bank, they needed a place to keep their wealth. The majority of their wealth was kept in the chapter house of the Treasury in Paris. Now, what happened was that when the Templars were being rounded up, the king's troops and various people were scouring France to find the Templar treasure. And there are all sorts of stories about where they tried and what they tried and whatever. But they never really came up with anything. So King Philip gained actually nothing at all at the end of it. But the chapter house treasure was what was supposedly placed on these 18 galleys, which were taken to Scotland and taken to Portugal. Now, interestingly, there is a painting at the Palace of Fontainebleau in France, which shows a Templar gathering at the Paris chapter house during that period, and there, at the front of their meeting hall, is the Ark of the Covenant.
Now, when did it apparently go to Ethiopia, if it did?
It didn't.
You don't think it went there?
No,
Okay.
there's no history. There's no history about that didn't appear until about the 1800s. It's very legendary, the Ethiopian story. In fact, the bit of it that even begins as being nonsensical is the fact that it starts off with a son of King Solomon secretly stealing the Ark of the Covenant and running away with it to Ethiopia. Now, from the Bible, which again is the only text that we actually have that anything could come from during that period about this, moves not only through King Solomon's reign, but through the reign of king after king after king after king after him. And in all of those reigns, it keeps telling us that the Ark of the Covenant was still at the Temple of Jerusalem.
This is fascinating.
And so we know that it wasn't taken, and in fact there is a particular time where one of the kings actually has it moved to a place in Shiloh to have it safeguarded for a while, and then it's brought back to the temple in the time of Jeremiah, the high priest, and at that time we're pretty much around the era of Nebuchadnezzar's invasion. So we know from the Bible that it was there. So these legends that came up in later times about it being moved secretly and stolen overnight and taken away by this son are nonsensical.
What's the last report we have, biblically or otherwise, about where the Ark of the Covenant might be? What's the very last, I guess... The
very last... Writing about it is a carving on a pillar of Chartres Cathedral, which was built by the Templars and their guilds of Masons in the 1200s. And this is on the gateway of the initiates to the cathedral. It actually shows a picture of the Ark being transported by knights, and it makes the point, this is where you go into the cathedral, and it makes the point that this is the place where the Ark was yielded. Now, there's the enigma. Yielded. What does that mean? The Ark was yielded at that place. To yield means to give up. Means all sorts of things. Somehow or other, it would seem from that the Ark was there, and then it wasn't there. And that's the last we hear of it. I mean, there's nothing after that which tells us where it went or what happened to it. But the indications are from other literature that the Ark was in France. We know from the painting it was very likely there. And it seems to have been connected with Chartres Cathedral, and then it's yielded.
See, I'm wondering, Lawrence, if it's in the home of some wealthy person somewhere. What do you think?
Who knows? I mean, the thing about the Ark is that it's one hell of a contraption. When I was writing about it,
let's talk about that when we come back at the top. I want you to describe what you think it now is or how it worked. Some people say if you touched it, you died, you got electrocuted. Now, the Ark of the Covenant, you started bringing up something fascinating, what it might consist of, what it might do, what it is. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, let's just start off with what it's described as being in terms of its construction.
Okay.
And again, we only have the Bible here, so we have to, if we're going to take anything as read, that's all we've got. Its measurements are given in cubits, which is a variable measurement between 18 and 22 inches. But taken at the lowest estimate, what you have is a box that was 45 inches in length and 27 inches wide by 27 inches high. So it's about 4 foot by 2 foot and 2 foot high, this box. It says it's plated inside and out with gold, and that its lid was made of solid gold. And on top of that were a couple of cherubim, whatever they were. Now let's forget the box and just think of the lid. I was fascinated by this lid. I thought, well, if you've got a lid that is 4 feet by 2 feet, and it's nothing but gold, if it's solid gold, apart from the fact that it's very dense and enormously heavy, it's actually quite a soft metal.
Mm-hmm.
And so it would have to be reasonably thick to avoid bowing in the center of this box. Well, the Bible, again, actually tells us that it was a palm span in depth. Now, a palm span, it was actually a measurement in those times, and a palm span was roughly equal to about 3.5 inches. So what you've got is 4 feet by 2 feet by 3.5 inches. That's a solid gold lid. Now, I got fascinated by this lid, and I got onto the World Gold Council, and I said, look, what the hell would this be worth, and what would it weigh? It would be enormous. Gold's as heavy as lead. Anyway, it transpired that they worked it out for me and came back, and they said that as far as they could ascertain, its weight roughly would be about 2,714 pounds. 4 feet by 2 feet by 3.5 inches. 2,714 pounds.
Wow, what could be created to make it that heavy? It had to be heavy gold. Lots of gold.
Yeah, tons of gold. I mean, 2,240 pounds are a ton, and this is 2,700 pounds. So what you've got is a lid that effectively seems to weigh more than a ton. And I said to them, what's that worth? And at the time, this was a couple of years ago, they said, well, that would be worth today about $10.5 million, just the lid. So we don't know. I mean, we don't know whether the Bible exaggerates here or whether it doesn't, but those are what we're given. Even if it were half that, and the Gold Council told me, well, if it was half that, it would bow anyway. It would need to be that more or less that thick to stay stable with these cherubim, whatever they were on top. And so, this is what begins to make nonsense of this son of King Solomon sort of secreting it out of the palace at night and taking it to Ethiopia.
Yeah, you can't just walk. How many people would it take to carry something like that?
Well, I don't know. Think of a car. I mean, I don't know what an average car would weigh, a ton to a ton and a half, maybe a ton and a half, something like that. How many people would it take to lift a car? I guess 8 people could do it.
And walk away with it? But for how long?
Well, no, not for long. I mean, you could lift it and perhaps move it a foot or two, I remember once being at the site of an accident where a lady had been run down by a car, and this was a Volvo saloon, and she was actually underneath the car, and it was leaking fuel and whatever, we had to get her out. The fire brigade hadn't arrived. And we didn't lift the whole car, but it took, I think, about 6 or 8 of us just to lift one side of it up enough for others to pull her out.
Okay.
So you wouldn't be able to carry it very far. And so these, if this weight is correct, if these sizes and weights are correct, then the pictures that we get of the Ark just being carried by, 4 guys and a couple of wooden staves wouldn't work.
All those things would have snapped.
You'd need more than that, but it doesn't say how many it took to carry it. It simply said it was carried on staves that were slipped through rings on its side. And so you have, this contraption here, which is enormously weighty. Now, interestingly, if we move from the Bible, and again here, we can only go by what we're told, but if we move into other Jewish literature outside of the Bible from the early period, the point that it makes is when the Ark was placed in the Holy of Holies in Solomon's temple, it always stood 3 fingers height above the ground. It described that it levitated.
Huh.
It was from this, apparently, that originally, remember, the Ark of the Covenant was said to be made by Bezaleel and Moses in Sinai, and it was that time, in fact, when the Levite priesthood was founded. Moses formed the Levites to be the guardians of the Ark. And in Latin, the term levis, as against gravis, which means heavy, levis means light.
Light, yeah.
And what you have is this situation where this story of its levitation seems to perhaps tie in with Levites and the fact that it was somehow or other light. It was said that the Ark moved before the troops when they went into battle. Now, it doesn't say that people were or weren't carrying it, so we don't know, but it just says it moved before the troops. Now, if it's moving before the troops, it's got to be going at a reasonable speed, so clearly somebody's got to be carrying it. But think of the weight again. You know, it's going to have to be something that perhaps is possibly levitational in its own right in some way.
You don't think it was some
to enable them to move it that quickly?
You don't think it was some kind of craft or anything, do you?
I don't think it was a craft, no. But I mean, it doesn't really matter what I think. What it did seem to have was amazing powers of destruction. They took it into battle. It won battles. If you go through the battles,
what do you mean it won battles?
Was
it a weapon?
Whenever they took the Ark into battle, they won the battles. Whenever they didn't take the Ark into battle, they didn't win those battles. And it was the Ark that seemingly helped to bring down the walls of Jericho, for example. It killed people. It shot out bolts of lightning. You know, it seems to sort of be producing very, very high-powered electrical charges of some sort.
It sounds like some kind of electromagnetic pulse weapon.
It sounds like a capacitor, and in actual fact, when it's reconstructed, it is identical in design to the first arc light capacitors that were used for street lights.
Was it a laser?
I don't think it was a laser. I think it was simply a very, very powerful capacitor. Think about its construction. It's made of wood, so what you have is an insulator. It is plated inside and out with gold, so you have negative and positive. You have a solid gold lid overall, which is now touching the negative and the positive, and you have on top these two cherubim, whatever shape they were. Now, if they are a negative and positive pole linked one to the outside plating and one to the inside plating, that would be exactly what was needed for electrical charging. And the word arcing, as in electricity, seems to have come directly from that sort of technology.
What would they have used it for, Lawrence? I mean, besides a weapon?
Well, it clearly was a weapon. Its story is interesting because it's one of two very major stories in that Sinai period. Moses had brought the Israelites out of Egypt. They were camped at this Mount Horeb in Sinai. That was where Moses got the Ten Commandments and the tables of testimony and that sort of thing. But the two big stories that came out of it were one about the building of the Ark of the Covenant, and the other one, the story of the golden calf. Now, the golden calf story, which links to the Ark story, is really what started to get me interested in what became the white powder gold research, in as much as that the story is that by burning this, I mean, Moses had gone up the mountain, his brother and the Israelites had got fed up because he'd been up there for so long.
Yeah.
When he came down, his brother said, look, I've collected up all the golden rings and stuff from the Israelites, and I've melted them down, and I've made this golden calf, and we're now going to worship this golden calf, and this God thing of yours is not on the cards for us. And Moses apparently got very angry, and the story is that he then burnt the golden calf with fire, transposed it into a powder, mixed the powder with water, and fed it to the Israelites.
Okay.
As if that was some sort of punishment. But, I mean, it sounds more like a ritual than a punishment.
Right.
But what struck me was the tying in with this, with the ark, with the electricity, and it says that he burnt the calf with fire and it became powder. But that simply doesn't happen. You know, if you heat or burn gold, it becomes molten gold. You know, it doesn't become
melts down.
Powder.
Yeah.
It just melts. And so there had to be more to it. So my feeling is that this is actually the beginning of a piece of history that moves through to King Solomon. King Solomon had this great brazen laver in his courtyard full of this white powder. We get to King Herod. Herod was apparently from the same temple. He was trading powder with the kings of Jordan. They were supplying him with all sorts of stuff in return in ways of technology and hydraulics and things like that. It seemed to me that there was very possibly a connection here, and what began to pin it together for me were older pieces of history from Mesopotamia, where the white powder gold in the olden days, real old days, was referred to as bread. They called it bread, white bread.
Was it manna?
The bread of life and the bread of light. Well, again, we have a similar situation in Sinai, where they have this white stuff that they eat, and it's called bread. And when you read the story of King Solomon, and this is quite interesting here because it's not written like this in the English translations. It's only in the original text that you find this, or the old text before translation. And we get back to King Solomon here, which is where we began tonight. What King Solomon was trading with these other nations in order to get their ships and their chariots and their horses and everything else that they were supplying him with was said to be bread.
Food.
He traded bread for their households. And they kept supplying him with gold for this bread. So it's kind of interesting that the stories begin to pull together. So the Ark, it struck me, was very possibly linked up with this story, in as much as that when it said Moses burned the gold with fire, what we're probably looking at is an electronic device here being used, very, very high power charging.
How would they know how to come up with that?
I don't know. I mean, it's like so many inventions. You look at them and you think, why would anybody have thought of that? How would they have thought of that? You know, where would it have come from? But in terms of electricity, I mean, we figure that electricity really came into being in the middle 1700s, and that certainly things like electrolysis, gold plating, that sort of thing, 1750s, we're looking at that sort of period. Now, in the year 1999, and running into its publication in 2000, there was a Harvard University and British Museum team out in Turkey. And they were investigating a gold refinery of a king called Croesus, who actually introduced the first gold coinage into the world in about 850 BC. And what they discovered out there were examples of the most wonderful gold plating. They tested it, they tried it, they did everything they could with it, and they said, we couldn't better it today, and it's the best form of electrolysis they've ever seen. Now, everybody said that's impossible, because there was no such thing then. They didn't have electricity then, and the British Museum said, well, look, we're going to write this book and we'll tell you all about it. So they did, and it's explained that, in fact, electrolysis was being used to do gold plating in about 800-odd BC. Now, that got the British Museum quite interested in how much older it might have been.
Right.
So they went back to some of their other items in their collection. They were looking at things which had been found from ancient Mesopotamia, 2,500 to 3,000 BC, that dated from the royal graves and that sort of thing in Ur. And they'd always thought they were solid gold, these daggers and various things that they had. It turned out that they weren't. They were made out of some sort of enormously heavy alloy plated with gold. And gold plating was impossible then. It wasn't possible until the 1750s. And so in the year 2000, the whole thing got blown apart. That they not only had electricity back in those times, they knew exactly how to use it for specific purposes, and gold plating was one of them.
Well, as you write in one of your books, The Lost Secrets of the Sacred Ark, this is fascinating. It truly is, just going back. Lawrence, I want to talk about Freemasonry after our break, because it is tied into everything we've been talking about.
It is, in a way, yeah. Yeah, it is.
And, of course, the Templars, as we move out of them, we'll get into the Freemasons, which, in your opinion, do they still exist today? I'm not talking about the Shriners and the great things they do for hospitals and children, but the deep Freemasonry organization, is that still around?
No, is the short answer to that is no. I mean, we can get into this after the break. There is no similarity at all today, hardly anything whatever, between Freemasonry now and Freemasonry as it was before the early 1700s. It changed totally between the years 1688 and 1720.
The fact that but we've always heard that so many U.S. presidents, for example, have had Freemasons.
Yeah.
I mean, that tells me it's a very powerful group.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it is a very powerful group. I mean, Freemasonry isn't set up these days to be a powerful group. It's a club of all sorts, and it's charitably based and all that sort of thing. And a lot of people belong to Freemasons. I mean, presidents and candlestick makers, there's no limit. So the fact that a number of presidents happen to be Freemasons means very little. A lot of shopkeepers happen to be Freemasons. A lot of postmen happen to be Freemasons. So when one looks at any particular group of people, one is bound to find a reasonable percentage of them that are Freemasons. And all of us know far more people than we think we know who are Freemasons. I mean, we all know Freemasons. I was one for 20 years. We all know them, but there's a lot of people who don't tell us that they're Freemasons. So the proportion is reasonably high. I mean, it's the largest membership club in the world overall, so every street's got Freemasons in it.
The lost secret of the Freemasons revealed, part of the Shadow of Solomon. What do you mean by that? The lost secret. What is it, lost secret?
It's the subtitle of the book. In general terms, publishers generally have more to do with selecting subtitles than authors do. At least they have done in my case.
Tell me about it.
I think if I'd have had more of a say in that and kept the same subtitle, I would have used the plural, being secrets rather than secrets. I mean, it sounds as if there's one
only
big
one
thing.
Yeah.
I mean, there is one big secret, I suppose, and it doesn't amount to a lot in the first instance, in as much as I said, Freemasonry has changed such a lot. And one of the premises within Freemasonry is that they are actually, at least from the year 1723, the brethren are told that their job is to search for their secret, or their secrets. The biggest secret, I suppose, that exists today within Freemasonry is that they don't know what the secret or secrets really are. I mean, there's a lot of ritual, a lot of ceremony, and a lot of good stuff that goes on, but it all revolves around being relevant to the secret or secrets when they discover what they are. And so that I would say is the big secret. There isn't one, and so therefore it becomes a secret, because who wants to admit that? I mean, I spent 20 years wondering what it was. I was introduced into Freemasonry in the middle 1960s. I became a Grand Lodge Master Mason in London. I couldn't have risen much higher in 20 years, and at the end of it, I still wasn't quite sure what it was that was so special that I was supposed to be learning. And I ended up resigning and sort of thinking, well, I can really do better on my own from this, because there are various books and texts that are mentioned that go back to Renaissance times and that sort of era, which it's suggested that one should read, but nobody ever reads them. So I figured I'd start looking back into these things and to find out what it was all about. And the biggest break that I found happened in the early 1700s, and it was actually all to do with the build-up towards the Jacobite rebellions. Freemasonry to that point in time, and it had come from a number of sources. It had come in through France and through Scotland. It had come in partly through Templarism, partly through stonemasons' guilds. But ultimately, in England, during the 1600s, its philosophical arm, and in fact Freemasonry in England, which became the sort of center of Freemasonry and the main focus of it, ended up coming from within the Royal Society of London, which is the great scientific institute which still exists today. It's our primary scientific academy. And at that time, those that were involved in this first sort of English Freemasonic institute were people like Christopher Wren and Robert Boyle, Edmund Halley, Isaac Newton, and all of these great scientists and philosophers and people of that middle era. Now, when 1688 came and the Stuart King James II was deposed, Freemasonry really fell apart at the seams in England. And remember, Freemasonry in other countries sort of went out from here after that. By the 1714, we had a new dynasty in charge. This was the Hanoverian dynasty in from Germany of King George I, and then the second, and then the third. And what happened was that the true documents of Freemasonry and what it was all about didn't get passed on from one dynasty to the next. And so the Georges began to reign, really running a royal society who was keeping secrets from the king. And so a new constitution was drawn up, in 1723, and this is available today. One can read the constitution, and it's a very interesting constitution. And what it really says in a nutshell is that we have now, from this date, to revise and reform Freemasonry because the secrets that were held in the order were all lost by Sir Christopher Wren. So they blame poor old Christopher Wren, the great architect of London after the fire, for losing all of the secrets of Freemasonry, and they had to start again. And from that date, they turned it into what became the Freemasonry that we know now. It became more club-like. It became more involved in business. It became to do with charities. Sure. They had schools and hospitals and this sort of thing. And yeah, it was all terribly nice, but it wasn't what it was. What it was before 1688, when the Stuarts were deposed, was wholly scientific. It was a philosophical institute which had been formed in England by King Charles II in 1662, and he'd brought the concept in from Scotland, because the Stuarts were Scottish in the first place, before they became kings of England as well, and he devised it on a basis of a Templar philosophical order called the Elder Brethren of the Rosy Cross. Now, this Elder Brethren of the Rosy Cross were basically scientists. And so it fell into the lap of the Royal Society. All of these great scientists that we know from that period who came up with all the remarkable discoveries of gravity and everything else did it from basically what was a Freemasonic institute. A lot of their stuff was published, a lot of their stuff wasn't. What I did find that was remarkably interesting was that certain things did actually get lost in time. Not everything was carried on because the King Georges limited the research that was going on within this establishment. They said, you're only going to research what we want you to research from now on. So they were kind of stuck. But in 1950, at Cambridge University, a whole load of completely unknown written documentation from Isaac Newton was discovered. Over 1 million words of writing and papers that he'd written about the work that he'd done, but was never ever published. It was never worked on, and it was his work with Robert Boyle. It was his work with other scientists of the Institute at the time.
So pretty phenomenal stuff.
Pretty phenomenal stuff. And one of the papers that grabbed my attention within that was a very lengthy treatise which he called Manna. Called it simply Manna.
It all comes back to that, doesn't it?
It all comes back to that, and it was within this that he claimed that whatever sciences that they were endeavoring to discover now, they were living in the shadow of Solomon, working in the shadow of Solomon. He claimed that the technology that was used for King Solomon's temple was in itself a technology, that almost that the temple itself was a mathematical piece of science. And maybe it was, because the Bible goes to great lengths to give us mathematical explanations of its construction and the width and the height and the breadth of everything within it, you know. So anyway, he drew the temple, he worked it out grammatically, and it all ended up with this manna. And as I mentioned before, you know, Solomon had this great laver in his courtyard, which was meant to contain this bread, this powder that he was trading with all of this other stuff. And what we discovered was that Robert Boyle, in the first instance, he's the guy that Boyle's law comes from. He was interested in gas pressures and all of this sort of thing. But he was an alchemist of a very high regard. He was probably one of the wealthiest men in Britain or in England at the time. He was the son of the Earl of Cork. And he really didn't have any need to work at all. You know, I mean, he was incredibly wealthy, but he really got stuck into this scientific environment. And he wrote about this powder, explaining that it defied gravity and various other things. So it became kind of magical, and for me, it again tied in. You know, this powder turns up not only in ancient Mesopotamian times, it turns up in the times of Moses, it turned up in the time of Solomon, it turned up in the time of King Herod, it turned up again in the time of the Templars, and there it was again in the time of the Royal Society. But again, it got lost. And this seemed to be part of what Freemasonry was said to be about.
Why does it get lost?
It was lost quite simply because of the fact that it was kept under wraps and then got lost or mislaid, one might say. You know, what we had this change of dynasty, and it really altered everything in Britain. And what you have to realize is that Wren and all the rest of them in that institute were supporters of the Stuart dynasty. The Stuart dynasty in 1688 was kicked out of the country, and by 1714 we had this German monarchy coming in, and from then on we had all of these battles that ended up with the big Jacobite rebellion in 1745-6, and throughout the whole of that period, just about everybody in the country supported one side or the other. They were either Jacobites and supported the Stuart kings, who were then in exile, or they were Georgian Whigs, and they supported the Hanoverian monarchy, and they didn't work together. They didn't pass secrets on to each other. So there was no way that a Stuart Royal Society was going to allow its secrets and the things that it was working on to fall into the hands of this new regime. And so what would have happened, and in fact what did happen by all accounts, is that the information was withheld. The new style of Freemasonry was brought into being. It's really quite interesting in as much as the new constitution was drawn up within weeks of Christopher Wren's death in 1723. They blamed him and his friends for everything, and the others by that time were pretty well all dead. And Isaac Newton wasn't. He sort of just fell in line and carried on doing his own thing. He was working on gravity then. And what seems to have happened after that is that it simply got forgotten about. Not lost, forgotten about, mislaid. Papers went missing, nobody knew where they were, and Freemasonry had become about something completely different. And it wasn't really until these papers were discovered in 1950 that it wasn't then, but looking back at it, it was what intrigued me to start looking further. I mean, I discovered all sorts of little things that went on. There was a book called Longitude a few years ago, which talked about the concept of calculating longitude and the man that did it. And it transpired that it wasn't him that did it at all. The papers are all there. They turned up again in another hall at a different university. They'd all been worked out by Robert Hooke and the Freemasons of the Royal Society back in the early 1660s.
Well, why does it seem that there's a conspiracy surrounding the Freemasons? I mean, almost like they're part of the Illuminati or the one world government.
Well, I mean, the thing is, within Freemasonry, like within anything, you're going to get your good guys and your bad guys. There's bound to be conspiracies that go on. Freemasonry itself isn't a conspiracy. I mean, I never felt it or saw anything of it in my 20 years. I saw little conspiracies going on, business things, but nothing on a major level. I suppose if I'd have belonged to a lodge that had presidents and prime ministers in it, I would have seen conspiracies at that level. But it's not about being a conspiracy. It's simply a place for people of like minds to sort of meet and do their thing, and a lot of what they do is pretty good stuff. I think what the biggest problem is that they are regarded as being a secret society in the first place, which actually they're not. Everybody knows about Freemasonry. The constitutions are published. You can find the rituals and the ceremonies in any library. One doesn't have to keep secret the fact that one is a member of Freemasonry. So there's nothing secret about it, except for one aspect, and that is that within the ritual, there are certain things within the ritual which are sort of meaningless, really, these days. And it's said that the brethren must not reveal these things to any outsider. And so although it's not a secret society, it's secretive. It's society with secrets. But what
were they hiding, Lawrence?
Well, when one looks at them and reads them, and this is what baffled me going through this, was that, I mean, one of the things, for example, is that it is announced as part of the ritual with a great flourish, as if it's an amazing revelation, that the Earth revolves around the sun. And this is one of the things that you're not really supposed to talk about. Well, the fact is, if you look back in time, you can work out why this happened. When Freemasonry was being developed, as it came in from the 1400s, in from France, into Scotland, into the 1500s, moving through that Renaissance period when the church controlled everything, anyone who had dared to utter that sentence, the earth revolves around the sun, would have been a heretic.
That's true.
Could have been punished, could have been executed.
Yes.
And so consequently, at that particular time, during that period, they had secrets. They weren't really secrets. They were things that they daren't talk about except among themselves. So what they did was that they invented a whole system of signs and tokens and secret handshakes, that sort of thing, so that they knew who was whom, and they could work out who was a fellow brother at that time, who they could discuss these things with openly, and who they mustn't. And so, one can see how it was that these things came into being. The other aspect of it, of course, was that branches of Freemasonry in the early days came out of stonemasonry and the guilds in France when they were building the cathedrals. So you had these guilds of masons. And the Masons had their own passwords and marks. They used to put their marks on buildings, and that Masons' marks, we know about those. But, they used to move around. They were very transient. They even moved from country to country, these stone workers. And what actually happened was that as you went through the degrees, you were given the sign or the token or the handshake or whatever of that new degree, so that when you went to an employer, he would immediately know what degree you were, what standing you were, what sort of job he could give you. And so you were never in a position to get a job that was above your station or above your qualification. So there are all sorts of reasons for these sort of secrety things coming in. But in terms of modern conspiracy, I suppose it it comes about because of the fact that there are many prominent and very powerful and very influential people who are Freemasons and make no secret of it. And on that basis, it seems to be deduced by some that is what Freemasonry is about. It's about power and control and all of this sort of thing. Well, yes, okay, there are people within it that are after exactly that. There are people who join Freemasonry at a very low level just to, get together with other lawyers if they're trying to raise their status in the legal profession. So people use it for all that sort of thing. But, just because the latest axe murderer turns out to be a Freemason, it doesn't mean that Freemasonry is about teaching you to be axe murderers.
Sure, unless 10 of them showed up that way.
That's right, yeah. But, people move into Freemasonry, it seems, in much the same way that I did. One gets involved in a business environment. People want you to join their club. It might be the Rotary or the Round Table, or it might be Freemasonry or whatever. And one moves into it without really knowing what it's all about, because it's all secret. They can't tell you. So it's not until one gets in that you then begin to learn and to go through the processes and go through the degrees. All I can say is that as I went through all of that, I was waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting for the big revelation. I was waiting for what was finally going to come, what I would know that was so important today. And all I learned was a whole load of stuff that seemed to be very important in 1700.
Well, Lawrence, let's talk a little bit more about this mystical white powder of gold. What kind of properties do you think it possessed?
Well, the properties that turned up really were learned about by accident onwards from the sort of 1980s, when the test started to begin after it was newly discovered. And they emerged out of the research and the testing because nobody knew quite what it was. It became impossible to test it, and they were trying spectroscopic analysis and neutron activation analysis and all sorts of things. And going through these processes, these various qualities and properties started to appear. The first one of any major importance seemed to be that its weight would fluctuate enormously. This actually tied in with some ancient Alexandrian texts that talked about the powder in about 300 BC and explained exactly the same thing about it. They said it could be made to weigh far more than its quantity of gold, or it would weigh less than a feather, and that's exactly what the scientists were discovering in the 1980s when they were testing it. So it had this quality of weight change, which actually, in terms of it becoming lighter, it was levitating. It began to levitate, and what they discovered was that strangely enough, it was transferring its levitational quality to things that it touched. They discovered that the pan that they had the powder in the lab when they were testing it would actually weigh more without the powder in it at a certain temperature than it did with the powder in it. So the powder was sort of transferring this weightlessness to the host pan. That was one of the qualities. What actually happened in another test, when they took its temperature up to an enormously high level, the stuff disappeared altogether. I mean, it just vanished into thin air. It disappeared. And so they figured, well, it's clearly got the ability to become invisible. And they tested the invisibility of it by a very simple process. If something is in front of you and it's there 1 minute and it becomes invisible the next, that simply means that it's still there, but you can't see it. So given that it was powder in a pan, what they did, they got a spatula and they sort of messed it up where it was and figured, well, when it comes back into vision, when we reduce the temperature, when we bring it all back, it should come back in a messed up state. But it didn't. It came back exactly like it was before it disappeared, before it was messed up. And from that, they learned that it actually had the ability to move into another space-time dimension. So that was another quality of it. Various tests were done in the medical field. There's one particular article in American scientist, where they actually took two grains, two atoms of monatomic ruthenium. It was actually not gold; it was ruthenium, one of the platinum group metals, in exactly the same state, and they just attached one of these atoms to each end of a DNA strand, human DNA. And the article is quite remarkable. They said that they thought that perhaps it would increase the electronic capacity of the DNA, because DNA communicates with itself through light waves, apparently. And what happened was that it multiplied this ability of DNA by 10,000 times, which was quite incredible. What they discovered from that was that it had a frequency, a light wave frequency, that was exactly the same as human DNA. And so they began to figure it could move into medical use. I mean, all the way through this, certain advantages were being seen. You know, it could be perhaps used for fuel cells. It was superconductive, which meant that it could transmit energy from itself to another version of itself somewhere else, whereas electricity needs wires and contacts to transmit energy. Superconductors of this sort don't. They can simply pass energy between themselves with no contact at all, so it became clearly an advantage in that respect. Fuel cells, clean energy, that sort of thing. What surprised me, in fact, it was just a little after I'd published Lost Secrets of the Sacred Art, which came out in March 2003, was that I'd been talking about all of this stuff, and you know, there was a fair bit of stuff to back it all up, but actually nothing had hit the mainstream. And suddenly, 2 months afterwards, it was in May 2003, suddenly it was there. And I managed to get the entry into the reprints of the book, but it wasn't in the first edition. And it happened in the Equity Gold Trust report, the prospectus that came out of the Securities and Exchange Commission in Washington, D.C. in that month, in May. And what it said was that it was trying to encourage investment in gold. This was the object of the thing. And what it said, that the future uses of gold will be in clean energy provision, fuel cells, environmentally friendly fuel cells, clean energy provision, and cancer treatment.
And isn't it also interesting that Zecharia Sitchin wrote that when the Anunnaki came here and needed gold, they needed to shoot particles of it up into their own atmosphere to kind of preserve it?
Once you get hooked into this and keep going back, the further back you go, you keep finding talk about this gold and about its various uses. And, I mean, way back in the times that Zecharia Sitchin writes about, and I did in one of my books, you get back to a period. I mean, writing really wasn't around forever, so we can't go back beyond a certain stage. But writings from about 2,500, 3,000 BC talk about this powder, which they call shemana. Now, shemana, which may be where the Hebrew word manna comes from anyway, actually means highwood firestone in ancient Mesopotamian. Highwood firestone. And it's kind of interesting because when you come down to Renaissance times, when you get to the Royal Society and the use of it, the name again, manna, they refer all the time to it being the same as the Philosopher's Stone, which was called a stone because it resisted fire like a stone. And this is exactly what the Mesopotamian text said 3,000 years before about the same stuff. And so it seems odd. And when we get to Freemasonry and how the secrets were lost, this was known about in 3000 BC, maybe earlier, but certainly then, in the time of Moses, in the time of King Solomon, in the time of Herod and Jesus, by the Templars, by the Royal Society, and then suddenly it gets lost, and we rediscover it in 1976. Okay,
Lawrence, where do we get this book, The Shadow of Solomon? here in the United States? Amazon.com?
It can be got from Amazon.com, it can be got from Barnes & Noble online, or it can be got from, I guess, whatever shops stock my books over there.
So can people eat these, powder, the white powder? I mean, why doesn't it come out in tablet form? Use it as supplements.
Well, I mean, there are a number of companies now, particularly in America, actually. I mean, I don't know of anywhere else, but there are a number of companies on my website that are selling products which are various forms of white powder gold. I mean, some of them are actually white powder gold. Others are monatomic elements of the same sort that come from natural sources, deep seabed sediments, Arctic ice, this sort of thing, because these elements are everywhere. I mean, you don't just make them out of gold, they're natural. That was how they were found in the first place in the 1970s. They turned up in a natural environment, and testing proves them to be what they were. But yes, I mean, one can buy products online, and I mean, I know plenty of people who have bought them and used them. Quite what I mean, the point with it is that what one is buying is essentially a product, but it's not necessarily a product in a super high spin state that is going to be levitational and all of those things. You know, one needs to put the thing through thermogravimetric meters and things to take it to those states.
Well, we deal with lots of mysteries here on Coast to Coast AM. And for the next couple hours, we'll be talking about ancient aliens and secret societies put together by none other than Mike Berra. Well, let's tell you a little bit about Michael Berra. Mike Berra is an author. He's a lecturer. He's a television personality. He is a self-described born-again conspiracy theorist. He began his writing career after spending more than 25 years as an engineering designer for a major aerospace company, several companies, where he was a card-carrying member of the military-industrial complex. Is he what Eisenhower warned us about? Mike has made numerous public appearances. I've run into him at all kinds of events. He's a great speaker. NASA, physics, UFO conferences. Mike has appeared on NBC, Universal Sci-Fi Network. And here he is back on Coast to Coast. If I had drummers, Mike, they'd be beating them right now. Oh,
yeah.
Good to have.
Well, and, I mean, it's great that I appeared on Sci-Fi, which is a network that just brought us Sharknado 3 tonight, which
right.
That was my show prep for tonight, was Sharknado 3. So
I love it. It was the last time I saw you was Contact in the Desert.
Yeah.
That was a great time.
It was a great time. It was...
you were swamped with people.
Yeah, well, it was. And, the thing about those shows is that they're really spectacular in terms of the number of people that they get in there, given the conditions, given how hot it is. And, it all has to do with the lineup of speakers that you have. You've got guys like, you obviously, and Eric Von Daniken, and it's been a great event. I'm going back next year, and I really can't wait because it's been my favorite event for a couple years now. And the energy there is different than it is anywhere else. Maybe it has to do with the fact the Integratron is nearby.
Mm-hmm,
Maybe there really are energy fields in that area. I don't know, but it really has been. It's just kind of rocketed to the top of the list of conferences just immediately.
Oh my gosh, they sure do. And our dear friend Jimmy Church thinks the world of you, Mike.
Well, I know Jimmy's a great guy, and he graciously allowed me to come on tonight and actually promo this show on his show, which was
did he? Good for him.
Yeah, really, really cool. So you should give him some props for that.
We will do that.
I know he's listening. I think he's had a few vodkas by now, though. So, he has. Let me tell you, he has the best vodka I've ever drank. Not that I've ever drank with Jimmy Church, but
he's been trying to get me to come over his house. Because we're both in the L.A. area when I'm here. But he always calls me 10 minutes after I get off a plane somewhere. And he goes, where are you? Come on by. We're having this party. Hey, give me a day's notice or something.
Yeah, I know. It's kind of my problem, too. I mean, I'm telling people, don't you realize how busy I am? I got so many things to do. Plus, now that I'm back in the LA area, there's so many fun things to do that you kind of got to schedule your weekends weeks in advance, right?
Yeah, indeed. Mike, lots to talk with you about tonight, including, of course, your new work, Ancient Aliens and Secret Societies. But have you been looking at these pictures from New Horizons on Pluto?
Oh, yeah, of course. They're spectacular and exciting. And the thing about them that's so interesting to me is that, once again, we continue to find out just how wrong NASA is about everything. They can't get anything right, because I think their models of the solar system and how it was created are all messed up. And Pluto to me is just another example of it, because for years, decades and decades, they told us it was an ice ball and probably covered with snow and ice, and they really didn't find much of anything to that effect. They found these mountains. They tried to say that these mountains were probably made of ice, but they have absolutely no basis for that statement. And you look at the pictures, and they look just like regular old Rocky Mountains to me. So then the question is, what are they going to find as the spacecraft continues its mission and goes out into what's supposed to be the Kuiper Belt? What if they get out there and they don't find any of the snowy objects that they're supposed to find? Which I think is probably what's going to happen. When does a point get reached? When do you reach critical mass to the point that NASA has to finally say, maybe our models of this whole solar system really aren't correct? Maybe how we think planets formed isn't the way they formed, and that to me is what's really exciting about it, because it kind of reinforces stances I've taken in books over the years. So I like that. I like NASA, giving me credibility when I don't even ask for it.
Well, and Pluto has 5 little moons around it. I mean, to me, it's a little planetary system. It's not a planetoid. It's a planet.
Yeah, and really, it is a planet, and Charon, which is the biggest of the moons, looks like a spherical planet. The rest of them kind of look like asteroids. And, our friend, the late Dr. Tom Van Flandern, his theory was that it was actually an escaped moon of Neptune because of some cataclysmic event that happened back in the early days of the solar system. And I think that that model is now really probably turning out to be correct, because neither of them appear to be small, icy dwarf planets, but they make a lot of sense as moons, because Pluto really fits into that size category and density category of a lot of the moons of Uranus and Neptune. So, I think we really are in a very exciting time. And the thing is, George, did you ever think we'd ever see anything like this in our lifetime? Because I never did.
Well, how old were you when we landed on the moon? Were you even born?
Yes, I was. I don't want to say how old I was, but I was old enough. Yeah, I was 9. I was 9.
Okay, you were a little boy.
Yeah.
You're a little boy. So, I was 19. So I witnessed it with my dad. Mm-hmm. I loved science, had a telescope. I was into all this, built little rockets. I did it all. I thought, answering your question, that we would have incredible technology one day and do all kinds of things. Mike, when I was a little kid, I built a little camera in the tip of a little rocket, and it took a picture, one shot, on its way down. And it was a little photograph, and gosh, I probably have it stored away in some box somewhere. It took a picture about 300 feet up of me and my friends looking up at it, and it was a little black and white photograph, and right. I'll just never forget it. And I said that day to my friends, I said, the time's going to come, we're going to take incredible pictures in space. And look what we're doing.
Yeah, it is fascinating. I mean, there's a picture that came out from, I don't think it was Galileo. It's a probe around Cassini, the probe around Saturn, and it was a picture of Saturn basically eclipsing the sun. So the sun was behind Saturn, and you saw the rings and some of the moons and the light coming through. And I guess I never really thought we'd see those kinds of things. I mean, maybe it's not that I didn't believe that we'd have advanced technology and things like this would happen, but I don't know. There was part of me that never thought they'd really share it with us, or that it would take so long, because I guess, things slowed down so much after Apollo, and we really stopped developing technology, and it seemed like it took so long. Now we all finally have Captain Kirk's communicators, from Star Trek. We finally have those, but gosh, didn't it take a long time? I mean, it took a really, really long time for that to happen.
It sure did.
I don't know. I guess I should have been more, thinking more forward. But I look at pictures from the '80s and stuff, and I think, what's really the difference between then and now? And the only thing I can really think of, and it's a huge difference, is the internet. That's really the only really major technological advance that we've had, because phones are still phones. You've got, you had primitive computers then. We have more sophisticated computers now, but it seems like we haven't really advanced as much as I
think the smartphones, beyond just cell phones, the smartphones now are incredible, because people at a moment's notice, they've got their computers in their pockets or in their hands, and they're able to get any kinds of information. Somebody wants a question about Mike Barra, and they're out. They just go to their smartphone, and
they'll get a whole bunch of
it.
BS about me that's not true.
And they get it all.
Yeah, right.
They get it all. So before we get into your book, Ceres, this object in the asteroid belt, which is, some call it an asteroid, others call it a dwarf planet. What the heck is it?
It's another moon. It's a moon of a destroyed planet, of which the asteroid belt is the remnants of that planet. I mean, some people have called it over the years Phaeton is the name that was given to it. And, there were two planets in the solar system that are missing. One about the orbit where Mars is now, and we know that Mars was a moon of that planet, which was destroyed. And there was another planet, this other one, Phaeton, was where the asteroid belt is. So, Bode's law says there should have been planets there, and there really weren't. And I think Ceres is a moon of that large world that got destroyed in some sort of unimaginable cataclysm that probably had really, really terrible, devastating effects on every planet in the solar system, and that's what I think it is. I think it's a moon. There's, again, how do a bunch of asteroids that supposedly collide together and somehow magically glue themselves together rather than break themselves apart? How do they form a sphere? How do they form that?
It's amazing
shape, and it's like it doesn't happen that way. These things are, I think, fissioned off from the planets the way, again, Tom originally theorized back in the late 90s. And, Ceres is just fascinating to me because it clearly, I think, used to be part of a different solar system. I think we had all kinds of mini solar systems all over this solar system. We had many, many planets with many moons, and most of them are gone now, but Ceres survives.
They say it was discovered in 1801. Why are we just starting to talk about it now?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I guess that it was not considered all that important, although it was thought at first to be, a missing planet. That's what they were actually looking for.
I mean, I didn't know about it.
Yeah, and they were looking for a planet back in those days between Mars and Jupiter, and they found Ceres, which helped to really perpetuate the discovery of the asteroid belt itself. But I guess it just hasn't been a high priority, although looking at it now, some of the pictures we're seeing, I think maybe it should have been a higher priority.
There's a pyramid on that thing, Mike.
Well, there's something, I don't know what that is. By the way, I was going to say I've got I have a Facebook page, Mike Barra Author, in parentheses, and if you search for that, I've got some pictures up on that page for people that are listening to go look at of some of the things we're talking about tonight, and I'm going to keep posting more. But, if you look at that pyramidal thing, I don't know, George, I don't really think that that's very pyramidal looking. I mean, it's weird to me that NASA called it a pyramid because it looks to me like a fairly common what they call a cinder cone, which is kind of a conical mountain. Now, it's weird that it's the only one on Ceres.
Yeah, it just pops right up.
Yeah, and that's a little strange because usually they're part of mountain ranges, but maybe one of your, maybe somebody like Stuart could come on and give us a little geologic assessment of it. But I didn't think it was really very pyramidal, and it weirded me out that they made mention of that. And then I thought about, well, what are they trying to distract us from besides the bright lights that they found? And, that was the same day, roughly, that the picture of the pyramidal kind of capstone rock, whatever you want to call it, on Mars was released from the Curiosity rover. So I kind of think maybe they wanted us to look at this pyramid that's not a pyramid and not really look at the pyramid on Mars that probably is a pyramid. So that's what I think was going on.
Lots of strange things going out there, Mike.
Yep.
Lots of strange things. Ancient aliens and secret societies. Tell me about this. Great title.
Yeah, thank you. It's pretty easy when you put Ancient Aliens in the title to come up with something to follow it up with.
It's a winner right there.
Yeah, exactly. But I'd done books about the moon, Ancient Aliens on the Moon, and I'd done 2 books on Mars, Ancient Aliens on Mars, and probably there could be a 3rd book in the Mars series because there's just so much stuff to look at on Mars.
Endless, yeah.
But I started to think about what did I want to do next, and what really got me was, okay, this stuff exists, these civilizations did exist. Somebody seems to have known from our distant past that they were there because of other research I'd done for other projects. I knew that somebody knew that this stuff was out there before we ever ventured into space, and those people were primarily members of secret societies like the Scottish Rite Freemasons and the real freak show of Aleister Crowley followers that operated out of JPL for a number of years and probably still do. And I started looking at all this, and again, looking at all the SS members, all the Nazi members like Werner von Braun, who had worked at NASA, and I began to think, okay, how did this information get from the ancient aliens to the guys who were working at NASA? Because I felt like there was definitely a connection there. And I started to think about, how do we connect that thread? And the first thought that I had was that this book was going to be, a lot about the stuff that I'd found in NASA, about a lot of the participation of the Nazis, the Freemasons, the so-called magicians out there at JPL, and the things that they had done, and all the stellar alignment work that I'd done, and the fact that they seemed to always want to land with Orion's belt and 33 degrees above the landing site, those types of things that just kept coming up. And I thought I was going to write a book about that. And then as I got into this, it kind of really began to shift for me, because I realized there was a lot of other stuff, other holes that were now being filled in. And the main thing was that all this stuff seemed to connect back to the Sitchin stories of the Anunnaki, these guys who came to Earth 400,000 years ago, and according to the legend, made us from them by manipulating our genetics and crossing us with them. So I started going off in that direction, and the more I dug into that, the more it appeared like there was these two different aspects to this. There's the very, very ancient story, and then there's everything that happened after the flood. And so then I started asking questions, well, did a flood really happen? And that started me, that was chapter 1, was there actually a flood? And, as I dug into that information, more and more, it became more and more obvious to me that there definitely was this flood that took place, and you've had a million guests on that have talked about it, and all the different legends from ancient cultures that have talked about floods and flood myths and arks and everything. And then I actually found some charts and stuff and put them together, and there are 35 or 45 different ancient cultures that have these flood myths that connect with an ark and with a higher angel or god telling somebody that there's going to be this huge flood, and you're going to have to build a boat. You're basically going to have to build an ark to survive this thing. So, that got me started on chapter 1, and I started then to focus on, okay, what really could have caused a global flood? And, there are really only a couple of answers, and the one that really stuck out was this idea of research of a guy named Randall Carlson, who is a geologist and has basically come to believe that there's something called the Younger Dryas impact event.
That means big freeze.
Yeah, about 12,000 years ago. But at the time, what it would have done is it would have, and again, looking at the pattern, the scatter pattern, he went back and looked at a lot of different evidence. One of the best evidence being these objects called nanodiamonds, which are really, really tiny, minute little diamonds that are formed during high-speed, high temperature impact events like comets and asteroids.
And heavy compression.
And they found these in a pattern basically sweeping across the northern hemisphere into North America. And I think they at least found 22 different sites, all dated to this one period of about 12,000 to 13,000 years ago, right around that time. And so it looks as though some sort of object like a comet came in and broke up and just scattershot it all across Europe and the Atlantic Ocean and North America. And if that had hit the huge polar ice caps that existed at that time with that kind of heat and impact, there's a couple things that could have happened. First of all, stuff would have instantly melted. Massive amounts of ice would have instantly melted, or massive amounts of water would have been, basically steam would have been ejected into the upper atmosphere and then fallen as rain. And as I dug deeper and deeper into it and talked to Randall more and more, I raised the specific question: could it have actually rained for 40 days and 40 nights if something like that had happened? And he said, yeah, absolutely. If the object was big enough and there were enough pieces and they were going fast enough, and these are the limits and they're all well within known parameters of impact events, and it hit the northern polar cap, which was massive at that time, he said easily it could have rained like that for even longer than 40 days and 40 nights, and that would have basically covered the entire Earth with water. So, I had a plausible scenario, and there's also another theory which is really, really interesting that is very popular with the Christian researchers, and that's this idea of a water vapor canopy. The idea that the Earth's atmosphere at one time was a lot thicker. And, they use that to explain, well, why did Methuselah and some of the people in the Bible, the very early patriarchs, why did they live 800, 900 years? And, the theory is that this very, very thick atmosphere basically protected us from a lot of the damaging radiation that damages and breaks down our DNA. And so instead of living only maybe 100 to 120 years, we were living 800, 900, maybe even 1,000 years while we were protected by this. And if an object like a comet or an asteroid went through this canopy and shattered it and broke it up and made it fall to the Earth, it would have fallen to the Earth as rain, and it would have covered the entire planet. And kind of looking at those two scenarios, both of them made a certain amount of sense to me. And, you start to look at the biblical verses, George, and they absolutely fit.
These secret societies, Mike, are we talking about the Masons and people like that?
Yeah, the Freemasons, the Nazis or the SS, and what I call the magicians, who were followers of Aleister Crowley and other practitioners of black magic and stuff. They're the three main ones that I think are significant because they ended up at NASA. Now, you hear about other stuff like, the Illuminati, but the truth is, George, I can't find any evidence that the Illuminati actually existed, whereas I can tell you for a fact, I can quote you chapter and verse, the fact that Buzz Aldrin, the second man to walk on the surface of the moon and the only man on Apollo 11 who was photographed on the surface of the moon, went there, in his personal preference kit with a Masonic flag, a 33rd degree Scottish Rite Freemason Masonic ceremonial apron that he took to the surface of the moon, and I am 95% sure I can basically prove that he performed a Masonic ceremony in the lunar module before he and Neil Armstrong went out on the surface of the moon.
What kind of ceremony would that be, Mike?
It would be what's normally called a communion ceremony. He's admitted that he did do this, that he basically broke bread and ate it and then poured wine and drank it, which is, again, theoretically a Christian ceremony. But If you dig into the background of it, it actually is a ceremony, an offering to the Egyptian god Osiris, who's represented by the constellation of Orion in the stellar religion of the ancient Egyptians, and is also depicted on all kinds of NASA patches, like the original Apollo patch actually had Orion on it for some strange reason, and that's got no connection to the Greek Apollo myth, so why it would be Orion on there, it's unless it was connected to the Egyptian is really hard to figure out. One of the lunar modules was named Orion, and they recently had the Orion program, so NASA kind of has this Osiris obsession. And, in fact, Buzz Aldrin went ahead and performed that ceremony, basically 46 years and 3 days ago. He did that on the surface of the moon, and I can show you that. So when I think of the secret societies, I look at the ones that I know exist that I can actually put my finger on. Some of them, the Illuminati, I can't really put my finger on them because there's really no proof that they exist other than the rumors.
Mike, let's get back to the Ark story a moment and this big freeze event as well. If the Ark story is correct, and we're going to use a little mythology here with you and biblical talk too, where is Noah's Ark? Where is it?
Well, the main place that everybody's always looked or always thought they would find it has been Turkey, because the Bible says that it came to rest in the mountains of Ararat. And that is known to be around what they consider to be, Mount Ararat. The problem is that it was Marco Polo, I think in the 1300s, who actually gave Mount Ararat its name. But there are there's other areas around there, very mountainous, next to Ararat, that are actually also called Ararat or variations of that name.
It's brutal terrain, isn't it?
It is very brutal. It is very high, and so that's where people have focused their attention. And the thing is, look, if there was an advanced civilization, an Atlantean civilization, and it was probably connected to the Anunnaki, such as Anunnaki, and they did survive, or they taught some humans, Enki anyway. The big thing that the story is that the story goes that Enlil, who was the ruler of the earth, didn't like mankind very much and was willing to let us be wiped out by the flood. But Enki, who was the creator, one of the creators of of the human race really loved us and wanted to save us. So that's why the God in the biblical version, who was, has to be one God, not two, kind of is of two minds. On the one hand, he wants to destroy mankind. On the other hand, he decides to tell Noah to build an ark and save mankind. So, the fact is that if there was a great flood, and there appears to be very solid evidence that there was, then logically there would be an ark. So why don't we go look and dig into the ark? That was my next question. And, I found out there's quite a bit of background stuff on the ark and on people that have searched for it over the years, and there's a lot of interesting stories. And turns out that there's two, I think, pretty good candidates that could both be the ruins, the wreckage of the ark.
Now, of course, I find it hard to believe, Mike, that he was able to take every animal in pairs on an ark.
Right.
What if he took DNA, however?
Yeah, that's what I think exactly, because actually some of the old writings from the various cultures say not just that he took animals 2 by 2, but he took the seeds, not just the seeds of the earth like the plants, but the seeds 2 by 2. And that could mean the seeds of the animals, which is also just genetic sampling, DNA. And, again, if you look at the stuff that Sitchin translated, the Anunnaki were nothing if not master genetic manipulators, and there's no reason why they couldn't have cataloged a lot of the flora and fauna and the animals and so forth that were here on Earth. And in fact, also, George, if you look at the history of a lot of these animal species, some of them didn't exist until around the time of the flood, if the flood was 12,000 years ago. So it's possible some of them were cobbled together after this whole thing happened, and they were, society and culture and civilization was being rebuilt. So, as I dug into this, what I found is that there was this object called the Ararat anomaly, which was photographed in a 1947 reconnaissance flight photograph on Mount Ararat itself, very, very high up, about 11,000 feet. And, the interesting thing about that is that there are stories of people who went and claimed that they saw the Ark in the early 1900s. George Hagopian was one of the people who claimed that as a little boy in like 1904 or 1905, he actually climbed up on the Ark. And
what happened to it?
Well, his dad shot at it, by the way. Yeah, so that's
nice.
I'm like, here's Noah's Ark. Let's shoot at it.
Yeah, same with Bigfoot.
Yeah, he said it was fossilized and stone-like, but he claimed that they were able to get up to this certain level that is not normally accessible because it was such a hot summer, and so much of the ice had melted. And he described it very specifically and made paintings of it. And then later on, another in the 1930s, I believe, another researcher or farmer was walking up there in the area, and he claimed to have come upon the same wreckage, only now it had been cleaved into two halves. It had been broken into two parts, and they were separated. And when you look at this Ararat anomaly images, if you look at the images, what you see is that it looks like the Ark is in two pieces. It's broken in half, and the ice has kind of come back in, and like the ice, when it grew back and rebuilt, it sort of split this wooden structure or stone structure by now because it was fossilized in half. So those stories are really interesting. And what's fascinating is that the paintings that were made based on the recollections of these two different guys were extremely similar, and the terrain was extremely similar, even though they really didn't know of each other's stories when they were first put together. So I thought that was really pretty interesting. But then there came up information on another site called the Darunapar site, because it was found again by, I think, a Turkish aerial reconnaissance pilot named, I forget his first name, but his last name was Darunapar, and he saw a boat-like outline in.
We've seen that picture, I think.
Yeah, and then this there were some expeditions there, and there were people who said, well, we didn't really find anything, we didn't find any wood. Well, after 10 or 12,000 years, the wood is going to become fossilized. It's going to basically take on the texture and the properties of the rock around it. And there have since been some other people that have gone there. There's a guy named David Fassold who was very, very interested in this area, and he brought ground-penetrating radar, among other things. And what he found, and this is one of the images that's up on the Facebook page, is basically when he used this ground-penetrating radar, he found that there were right-angular cross-supporting beams buried under the mud and the dirt. And basically what you're looking at is a couple of keel beams and some cross beams and all of this stuff, plus the fact that they found rivets there. They found metal rivets. They found all kinds of other features like supports on the side, outside supports that appeared to be structural and curved like you would on the outside of a boat, and the fact that it is exactly 500 Egyptian cubits long, which is exactly the length given in the Bible for the Ark, makes it, to me, pretty convincing that I think that might be the site. That's at about 6,500 feet. That might actually be the site where the Ark did come to rest, and this thing might actually be the Ark of Noah. So,
what a great discovery if that happens.
Yeah, and again, it's debatable. It's up for debate, but there's a lot of study that's been done, and I'm convinced that one of those two sites is probably really the Ark.
Many of us all know the theories of the late Zecharia Sitchin, Mike, of which he believes that there was a planet in our solar system called Nibiru, 3,600-year elliptical orbit, right, and that the inhabitants of that planet, the Anunnaki, came here to mine for gold, then genetically manipulated the creatures that were on this planet, and hence here we are. You have a different twist to this.
Well, I think that some of the things that have been said about the Anunnaki that Sitchin wrote early in his career are not the same as the things he wrote later. And people don't seem to pay as much attention to his later books, but they should, because this, was far deeper into his research path, and he understood things better. For instance, it's often said that we were created as a slave race. Well, no, we weren't. And apparently, according to Sitchin, there were actually very long moral debates about whether we should be created at all, because we would not be creatures, we would be beings, as they described it. In other words, conscious beings with souls, and they didn't think that was on the same level as creatures, so they didn't treat us that way. So that's kind of a misreported aspect of his research. But as I got into this, I started watching. I watched the film Noah with what's his name?
I hated that movie.
Yeah, well, it was really bizarre, but it was...
you probably
Russell
watched,
Crowe.
Knowing you watched it with Russell Crowe.
Yeah, Russell Crowe, yeah, thank you. Russell Crowe and Jennifer Connelly, whose name I would never forget. But, I watched the movie, and it was really fascinating. It was weird to me because there was the sky was different, and things were different on the Earth, and there were these guys called the Watchers. And I started asking myself, who are the Watchers? They're mentioned in the Bible a few times. They're called angels. Yeah. There were something like 200 of them, and in the film, they are basically neither divine angelic beings nor are they fully beings of the earth.
They were rocks, weren't
right,
they?
But because they have that aspect, that earthly aspect, they were bound to the earth, it said. And, and then I started reading, after that, I started reading Sitchin's book, The Lost Book of Enki, which is advertised as historical fiction. Was that his last book? It was very close to his last book. Yeah, I think it was 2010. But, it's called historical fiction, but the truth is I have a friend who knew Sitchin extremely well. And I talked to him about it, and I said, look, what can you tell me about this book? And what he told me, and I probably shouldn't say this on the air, but I'm going to say it anyway, is that at the end, Sitchin was not getting his information from the clay tablets and cylinder seals, but that he was getting it directly from the Anunnaki themselves.
Oh, really?
And that story in there is not fiction at all, that it was actually supposedly, quote, according to Sitchin, he says... Sitchin
almost like they wrote it through him, or he wrote it through them.
That Enki dictated this, because it's basically Enki's story of the things that happened.
Wow.
These things that happened, and the way things really happened from 400,000 years ago to today. And then I thought, well, I'd better read this as part of my research. And I got into it, and, I found, the story, George, is it's absolutely tragic, really.
Tragic and fascinating.
Fascinating, tragic. But it's like they had the same human foibles that we had, even though they might have had advanced technology.
Maybe more.
Yeah, and there were all sorts of things. Girls get involved, and the men cross-marrying and everything, and the rivalry between Enki and Enlil over who was going to run the planet was very intense, because Enki was actually born first, but according to the legal laws of succession, he was not. He was born to a concubine, not to a legal spouse, whereas Enlil came along later, and there was a big fight between who was the wiser and who was the one who really should run the planet. But Enki was the scientist, and, he helped create the Adamu, the very first man. And, there's other things. People look at some of these images of and think of them as giants, and the Anunnaki as giants. And, I'm not convinced that they were. I don't think they were really very much different from us in terms of their physical stature, because you look at some of these images where Ninhursag or Ninma, as she's called, is holding the Adamu, and they're saying, oh, well, look at how much bigger she is. And it's like, that's because he's a baby, There's this missing aspect to it. So, because then also they couldn't have interbred with human females, and if they were some gigantic size, they simply wouldn't have been able to physically put it together. So what got me really going on this and really starting to look at this in a whole new way was the fact that what that meant to me was that their intentions were not to enslave us, to treat us as less than them. They did try to limit us to a certain extent because they didn't want us to make the same mistakes that they had made.
Or revolt.
Right, or revolt. And it turns out that there were 200 guys working on Mars, the exact same number of the Watchers in the Bible, and just like the Watchers in the Bible, they came to Earth for some R&R, and they complained about their situation, that there were no women there. Mars needs women, apparently. It was a lonely place, and they needed women, and they were unhappy with their circumstances, and they didn't get good enough answers from Enlil. And what they did was that they picked wives for themselves, and they kidnapped them and stole them away and did revolt. And they were called the Ijiji. So the Watchers and the Ijiji seem to be the same thing. And it's just fascinating to read these stories. And the name of their commander was Satanal, Satanail, Satanal or Satanal. So, where do we get the name Satan from? So, as you start to put all these things together, it becomes really obvious to me that all this ancient stuff, all these stories, are probably a lot different than we think, and even different maybe than Sitchin interpreted them originally, because he changed a bunch of information as he started writing this historical novel. And I'm like, well, why would he do that? Why wouldn't he be consistent with what he wrote unless he was corrected by some new source? And, it also kind of really aligned with information I got from Bob Dean, who has done, read the official book. And he told me, he said it very publicly, extraterrestrials are not working with the government. They are the government, that there are Anunnaki still here on this planet.
So they never left.
They never left. They tried to, a lot of them left. Most of them left because it's like the moment in the Lord of the Rings where one of the elves says, it's the time of man now, and we need to leave and let men run things. And it was the same analogy that was made, that I think at the end of their big battle that Enki and Enlil kind of agreed that they needed to go away and let us have our own path. But I don't think they really left. And I've been, again, told directly by a source who knew him very well that book was dictated to him by Enki, who is still here. And if their lifespans were as long as Sitchin thought they were, that's not impossible. He could certainly have lived another 5, 6, 7, 8,000 years right into today, and he wouldn't be a whole lot older than he was back then, back in about 5000 BC, when I think they all packed up and pretty much went away. And you had, I think, some Anunnaki who probably stayed behind here because they would rather be kings on Earth and be worshipped as gods than be workers back on Nibiru. And I think the last of that line of guys was probably Goliath, who was slain by David. And I'm sure he was a big guy. Maybe he was 6 or 7 feet tall, but
maybe 8.
Yeah,
and
David, David killed him and sort of established our own kingly line. And so all these things begin to come together, and they all begin to focus on one guy who stayed behind and stayed in charge. And that guy's name is Marduk. And he was a son of Enki, and he is the guy for whom Cairo is named. Cairo is an Arabic word meaning Mars. The planet Mars was changed to that name because of him, and he was there for a while running things, and he's the one, I think, who started the secret society.